Welcome, dear friends, to Wisdom Before Sleep. Tonight, we're going to settle in together for a long, quiet journey. The story of how one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen slowly cracked, crumbled, and, almost without noticing, turned into something entirely new. From the first distant rumbles in 1905 to the cold winter morning in 1922, when the Soviet Union was quietly born, we'll walk through it all one gentle chapter at a time. If you'd like to see the whole path laid out in front of you, just glance down to the video description. All the titles and timestamps are waiting there, like a softly lit map, so you can see the whole picture whenever you wish. For now, though, let's simply begin where every long story begins. At the very beginning, when an empire still looked unbreakable, but something inside it had already started to ache. Chapter 1. The Quiet Breaking of an Empire. Russia's Last Years Under the Tsar, 1905 to 1914. As the 20th century approached, the Russian Empire still stretched across continents, immense and imposing on any map. Yet beneath this vastness lay a quiet fragility. The Romanov dynasty continued to define its authority through the old triad of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, a doctrine crafted for an earlier age. But Russia itself was changing in ways the imperial system could not fully comprehend. Factories rose in cities that grew faster than the state could guide. A new industrial workforce emerged, living and laboring in crowded districts where expectations were shifting. A middle class expanded as well, increasingly aware of how little voice it possessed in the governing of its own country. At the center of this tension stood Tsar Nicholas II, a ruler who believed deeply in the sacredness of autocracy, yet struggled to understand the society evolving around him. He inherited reforms that were only half completed. His grandfather, Alexander II, had freed the serfs and introduced local councils to manage small areas of public life. But the bolder steps, creating a nationwide representative assembly or offering a more open political sphere, were never taken. The gap left behind was filled with frustration, especially among the educated classes who had hoped for a more modern Russia. By Nicholas's reign, the state relied heavily on censorship and secret police surveillance to control this unease. Across the empire, the sense grew that change was coming, but the political order was too rigid to respond. Russia felt like a sealed vessel, slowly filling with pressure, waiting for the moment when it could no longer hold. This underlying instability soon revealed itself on the world stage. In 1904, Nicholas's ministers encouraged a military conflict with Japan, convinced that a quick victory would unite the population and quiet domestic tensions. Instead, the war became a national shock. Russia's outdated equipment, disorganized logistics, and poorly coordinated command structure collapsed under the weight of Japan's newly modernized forces. Port Arthur fell. Entire units were lost. And in May 1905, the Baltic Fleet, one of the empire's proudest symbols, was destroyed at Tsushima in a devastating battle that echoed across the globe. It was the first time a European great power had been defeated by an Asian nation in the modern era. More than 400,000 Russian casualties accumulated. Food prices rose. Families waited anxiously for news that seldom brought comfort. For many Russians, the war confirmed a troubling truth. The government that ruled them with such confidence was deeply incapable of protecting the nation's future. peasants saw taxes rise to fund a conflict that offered them nothing. Workers endured stagnating wages even as the demands of wartime production increased. Even aristocrats felt humiliated by the scale of defeat. A historian observing the period later noted that Russia had endured enormous losses for a cause that ended in embarrassment, and that these losses added powerful fuel to the growing unrest that would erupt in 1905. The confidence that once sustained the monarchy had been badly shaken, perhaps irreparably. The year 1905 became a turning point, and its most haunting moment unfolded on a cold January morning. Tens of thousands of workers and their families gathered in St. Petersburg, carrying icons and portraits of the Tsar as they walked toward the Winter Palace. At their head was Father Georgy Gapon, an Orthodox priest who believed that if the Tsar only heard the people's suffering, he would act with compassion. Their petition asked for simple, humane reforms: fair working hours, the right to organize, improved living conditions, and civil liberties. Many still held on to the old belief that the Tsar was a kind protector, unaware of the hardships his people endured. But Nicholas II was not there. Unsure of how to respond, officials panicked. As the procession approached the palace, soldiers fired into the crowd. At some points, mounted Cossacks charged with sabers drawn. The scene that followed was tragic and unforgettable. Hundreds were killed or wounded. Father Gapon narrowly escaped, crying out in despair that the bond between the Tsar and the people was shattered forever. In the weeks that followed, the entire empire trembled. Strikes spread through factories with astonishing speed. In the countryside, peasants rose up, burning manor houses and seizing land. In the navy, the crew of the battleship Potemkin mutinied, an act that became a symbol of the moment's volatility. Various nationalities across the empire pushed for their own rights and autonomy. What had begun as a peaceful appeal had turned into a wave of upheaval that seemed almost unstoppable. Facing turmoil across nearly every region of Russia, the government finally turned to concession, at least on the surface. Under the guidance of Count Sergei Witte, Nicholas II published the October Manifesto, a document that promised civil liberties and the creation of a legislative assembly. For many moderates, it appeared to mark the beginning of constitutional rule. Some believed that Russia might still transform peacefully into a more open and representative society. But others, especially the socialists, considered the manifesto a strategic illusion meant to divide the opposition. For a moment, the promises eased the crisis. Strikes slowed, and many hoped that cooperation between society and the throne was finally possible. Yet beneath this calm, another reality unfolded. Pyotr Stolypin, the new prime minister, launched a sharp crackdown on those who continued to resist. Thousands were tried in swift military tribunals, and executions became common enough that the noose gained a grim nickname: Stolypin's necktie. At the same time, he pursued ambitious agrarian reforms, encouraging peasants to leave the communal farming system and establish private holdings. He believed that stable, property-owning farmers would anchor the empire and give it the time it needed to modernize. As he once declared, give him 20 years of peace and Russia would be unrecognizable. But Russia would not receive 20 years. The reforms unfolded unevenly, and the government soon undermined the very political concessions that had calmed the unrest. When the first two Dumas proved too outspoken, they were dissolved. In 1907, the electoral rules were altered without legal authority, reducing representation for workers, peasants, and many national minorities while increasing the power of conservative landowners. A new Duma emerged, one more compliant, and far more aligned with the government's wishes. By the end of this period, Russia looked calmer on the surface. Factories resumed production, Ford investment increased, and the Third Duma completed its full term. But the stability was thin. The roots of discontent, land shortages, worker grievances, political exclusion, and the aspirations of minority groups remained deeply embedded in Russian society. Observers at the time sensed that the quiet was deceptive, a thin crust over deeper tensions. One remarked that the country resembled a volcano, still and silent for the moment, but with immense pressure building beneath. As the empire stepped toward the year 1914, it did so carrying all the unresolved weight of the past decade. The outward calm masked the inner strain, and while no one could yet see the full storm approaching, the structures of autocracy were already weakening, their foundations too brittle to bear what was soon to come.
Chapter 2. When the War Came Home. Russia in the Great War, 1914 to 1916. As the summer of 1914 unfurled across the Russian Empire, there was a brief moment when the atmosphere felt strangely unified, almost serene, as if an old and restless land had paused to take a single shared breath. The outbreak of the First World War had created a sudden stillness in the political storms that had long shaken the Romanov state. For the first time in years, Russia's conflicting voices seemed to speak in harmony. Strikes that had rattled the capital fell quiet. Fractured political groups softened their criticisms. Even workers who had once marched under angry banners now joined crowds singing hymns beneath the glowing lamps of Petrograd's boulevards. For a fleeting instant, many believed that the war might pull the country together. The State Duma, often so divided, voted unanimously to support the empire's entry into the conflict. When Nicholas II appeared on the balcony of the Winter Palace after war was declared, people crowded the square beneath him with a kind of hopeful reverence. Some bowed, some crossed themselves, others simply stood in silence, imagining that perhaps, just perhaps, the tides of history might be turning in Russia's favor. But this hopeful unity was fragile from the start, like thin ice forming on a river that still churned beneath the surface. The sense of togetherness depended on a belief that the war would be brief and glorious. Yet the modern world was entering a new kind of conflict, one shaped by factories, explosives, mass mobilization, and unthinkable casualties. When that harsh reality arrived, the thin ice of national unity cracked almost immediately. A nation strained beyond its limits. Russia's vastness had always been a source of pride, but during the war it became a heavy, unmanageable burden. The government mobilized roughly 15 million men, an army so large that it drained life out of the villages that had supported the empire for generations. Entire regions lost not only their fathers and sons, but also their laborers, their horses, and their rhythms of agricultural work. The fields yielded less each year. The granaries emptied. In the cities, bread lines grew longer and more desperate. By 1916, shortages reached a new and painful intensity. The country's already fragile industries struggled under the weight of war production. Materials needed at the front were siphoned out of civilian life. Trains struggled to move grain to urban bakeries. Sometimes food sat motionless in stalled rail cars, while those in Petrograd waited for hours in wintry darkness just to receive a small ration. Prices soared, rising faster than any worker's wages. Many families, already exhausted by years of hardship, now faced a simple daily fear, not knowing if tomorrow's bread would be there at all. Historical records describe real wages in the cities falling to about half of their pre-war levels, and the bread allotment in Petrograd shrinking to a meager amount that barely sustained life. Such conditions, repeated day after day, pressed a quiet, unrelenting weight upon the people. Inside this atmosphere of scarcity and cold, the early spirit of unity dissolved. Strikes surged again. Factories trembled with discontent. The emotional distance between the government and its people widened until it felt impossible to bridge. What had once been a patriotic surge now gave way to a different feeling entirely: fatigue, grief, and a growing loss of faith. A monarchy losing its place. At the front, the Russian army endured devastating defeats. In the early battles of Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, tens of thousands of soldiers lost their lives or were captured. These were not small setbacks. They were devastating blows that shattered confidence in the empire's ability to wage war. Commanders blamed the government blamed the commanders, and ordinary soldiers, hearing the stories of mismanagement and blunders, quietly whispered that something was deeply wrong. In August 1915, Nicholas II made a decision that would change the course of his reign. He took personal command of the army. He hoped to inspire courage, but instead he tied his own reputation to every failure on the battlefield. The weight of each defeat now fell squarely upon him. And as he spent more time away at military headquarters, he left the heart of government in the care of his wife, Empress Alexandra. The Empress, already unpopular for her German heritage, became the center of swirling rumors. In a time when the empire was fighting Germany, whispers that she secretly sympathized with the enemy spread quickly. Yet what most unsettled the public was her reliance on a mystic healer named Grigory Rasputin, a man who had gained her trust because he seemed to alleviate the suffering of her hemophiliac son. In a darkening capital filled with hunger and suspicion, Rasputin's presence at the center of power felt unsettling, almost ominous. Ministers rose and fell with dizzying speed. Some served for mere weeks. Others were replaced because Rasputin or Alexandra lost confidence in them. The government's inner structure, once rigid and slow, now felt chaotic and directionless. Politicians across the spectrum, even those loyal to monarchy, began to mutter that the empire was drifting without a steady hand. Reports sent to the Tsar late in 1916 painted a grim picture. He no longer had trustworthy supporters among those closest to him. In the shadows of Petrograd's nighttime streets, conspirators whispered that Rasputin had to be removed. When he was assassinated in December, poisoned, shot, and thrown into a river, it did little to soothe the nation. The damage to the monarchy's moral authority had already been done. A country approaching its breaking point. By the end of 1916, faith in Nicholas II had nearly evaporated. Members of the Duma, many of them conservatives, urged that the monarchy must change or collapse entirely. Generals at military headquarters quietly signaled that the Tsar no longer commanded their confidence, and among the ordinary soldiers fighting in freezing trenches, the whispers of discontent now grew louder each week. In Petrograd and far beyond, the air seemed to hold a certain stillness, the kind that comes before a storm. People stood in bread lines for hours, clutching empty baskets. Factories trembled with strikes. In the countryside, families waited for letters that no longer arrived from sons who had perished months earlier. And in government buildings, where ministers had once debated policy, there was now only confusion, fatigue, and a dawning realization that the old order was nearing its end. As 1917 approached, the empire was not only fighting a war abroad, it was beginning to unravel at home. No one could say precisely when the breaking point would come, but many felt it approaching with unmistakable certainty. The monarchy had lost the confidence of its people, its parliament, and its army, and in the cold streets of Petrograd, the spark of revolution was already flickering into view. The story of Russia in the Great War is not only a tale of battles and generals, it is the quiet narrative of a society slowly overwhelmed by grief, scarcity, and disillusionment. It is the story of how a vast empire, once held together by reverence and fear, began to come apart under the immense pressure of a modern war it was not prepared to fight. And it is the unfolding prelude to the moment when the old world, with all its certainties, would give way to something entirely new. Soon, in the early months of 1917, the storm would finally break.
Chapter 3. The winter that ended 300 years, the February Revolution, 1917. If you close your eyes for a moment and imagine Petrograd in the winter of 1917, you can almost feel the cold in your bones. The streets are buried under dirty snow, the wind blows straight through thin coats, and in front of bakery doors, long lines of women and children stand silently, waiting for bread that may never come. Behind those lines stretches a whole history of disappointment, years of war, hunger, broken promises, and a government that seems farther away with every passing month. It was in this atmosphere that the Russian Empire, 300 years old, quietly began to crack. For a long time, the signs had been there. The war had dragged on far longer than anyone expected. Husbands, sons, and brothers were taken from the villages and thrown into trenches. Many never returned. Those who did wrote home about boots that fell apart in the mud, rifles that jammed, and battles that seemed senseless. In Petrograd and other cities, factories worked day and night to feed the front, but food and fuel for ordinary people grew scarcer. Wages lost their meaning as prices climbed higher and higher. People waited in queues for hours in the frozen dark, only to be told that the bread had run out. Even the secret police, whose job was to watch, record, and warn, were reporting that the mood in the capital had turned from grumbling to something sharper and more dangerous. They noted that when soldiers fired on demonstrators in late February, causing casualties, large parts of the garrison soon went over to the crowds instead of standing by the authorities. That in itself was a quiet revolution already beginning inside the army. And yet no one had written a plan for what came next. There was no single leader hiding in a cellar, waiting to press a button. The revolution that arrived did not begin with a manifesto or a speech. It began with empty stomachs and cold hands. On February 23, 1917, according to the old Russian calendar, the city marked International Women's Day. It was meant to be a symbolic, almost ceremonial date. But in the Vyborg district of Petrograd, where textile mills filled whole neighborhoods with smoke and noise, thousands of women did something simple and extraordinary. They stopped their machines. These were women who had spent winter after winter standing in bread lines in sub-zero temperatures, women who juggled endless factory shifts with the burden of feeding their families. That day, they decided that queuing and waiting were no longer enough. They left the mills and poured out into the streets, calling out not just for bread, but for bread and freedom. Their voices echoed between the gray factory walls as they crossed the frozen river and made their way toward other industrial districts. At each factory gate, they stopped and shouted up at the windows, asking the men inside to join them. The message was not wrapped in theory. It was direct and human. We cannot live like this anymore. Come with us. By the next day, the wave had grown into a torrent. Over 200,000 workers in Petrograd were on strike. Whole factories emptied as workers locked their tools away and marched together.
Crowds flowed down Nevsky Prospect, the city's main avenue, overturning Tsarist eagles and imperial emblems, singing the Marseillaise, that old song of another revolution across the continent. What had begun as protests against bread shortages quickly took on a new tone. Even without any party issuing instructions, the crowd spoke in political slogans. Down with the Tsar, down with the war. These were not careful demands, they were verdicts, shouted into the icy air. At first, the government treated this explosion of anger as if it were just another disturbance. Police units and some army detachments were ordered to restore order. On February 25th and 26th, lines of demonstrators met lines of soldiers in the streets around Znamenskaya Square. Shots were fired. Dozens of protesters fell. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the familiar pattern would repeat itself. The regime would respond with bullets, the crowds would scatter, and fear would once again settle over the city. But something essential had changed. The soldiers standing behind those rifles were not loyal guards in gleaming uniforms devoted only to the autocracy. Many were peasant conscripts and war-weary reservists who had spent months or years at the front. They were tired, cold, hungry, and uncertain why they should keep dying in the trenches. Looking at the people in the streets, women like their mothers, workers like their brothers, they saw not enemies, but reflections of themselves. Some soldiers fired high on purpose, sending bullets into the air rather than into the crowd. Others lowered their rifles altogether. Cossack cavalry, who had once been the reliable sword of the Tsar, famously refused to charge into a group of demonstrators, simply standing still as the protesters walked around them. Secret police reports later noted this hesitation and the quiet sympathy between troops and crowds, recognizing that the invisible line separating army and people was dissolving. That hesitation, that refusal to move, was the beginning of something the regime could no longer control. Then, on February 27th, the hesitation gave way to action. At the barracks of the Volinsky regiment, soldiers were again ordered to go out and fire on unarmed civilians. This time, they refused outright. Led by a sergeant whose name would echo through later accounts of the revolution, they turned their weapons not on the crowds, but on their own officers. The regimental commander was killed. The soldiers marched out of the barracks, rifles on their shoulders, not as a disciplined unit obeying orders from above, but as rebels joining the crowds they had been told to suppress. Their mutiny spread with astonishing speed. As if a signal had been given, men in other regiments, the Litovsky, the Preobrazhensky, the Pavlovsky, followed the same path. They disarmed loyal officers, freed comrades under arrest, and opened up the arsenals. Tens of thousands of rifles were handed out to workers and demonstrators who had previously been unarmed. The balance of power in Petrograd shifted almost in a single day from those who wore epaulettes to those who wore workers' coats. Once that line was crossed, events unfolded with the unstoppable momentum of something long held back. Police stations were attacked and set ablaze, their files and portraits destroyed. Government buildings were stormed. The notorious Kresty prison, a symbol of the state's power to lock away its critics, saw its doors burst open as crowds freed political prisoners and common inmates alike. People climbed up on roofs to pull down the double-headed eagle, the emblem of Romanov rule, from flags and facades. That evening, insurgent soldiers and armed workers seized the vast Winter Palace, the symbol of imperial power at the heart of the city. Only months before, citizens had stood outside its gates, begging for protection and justice from the Tsar inside. Now the palace stood largely empty, its former ruler stranded far from the capital, its doors no longer defended by loyal guards. By nightfall,
It was not soldiers in the Tsar's uniform, but revolutionaries who controlled Petrograd. What made this all the more remarkable was the absence of the famous names that would later dominate the story of 1917. Lenin was still in neutral Switzerland, anxiously following events through newspapers. Trotsky was in New York. Stalin was in Siberia. The February Revolution was, in a very real sense, a revolution without a script and without its later stars. As historians have emphasized, it was a genuine mass uprising, sparked not by a central committee, but by the cumulative weight of war and hunger on ordinary people. In those days, it was women queuing for bread, workers stepping out of their factories, and soldiers refusing to fire who determined the fate of an empire. Yet, even in the midst of this seeming chaos, new forms of order began to emerge from below. People did not simply destroy the old, they also started building the new. Workers and soldiers who had taken to the streets did not want lawlessness. They wanted a different kind of authority, one that listened to them. Almost instinctively, they turned to an institution that had first appeared in the upheavals of 1905 and never entirely disappeared from memory: the Soviet. In Petrograd, revolutionary activists, many of them Mensheviks and social revolutionary intellectuals, hurried to the Torrid Palace, an imposing building that had been the home of the State Duma, the semi-parliament created after the earlier revolution. On February 27th,
They convened the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. Each factory and each military unit was encouraged to elect representatives. The Soviet saw itself as the voice of those who had made the revolution, the workers and soldiers whose actions had toppled the old order. At the very same time, in different rooms of the same building, another group was meeting: deputies from the dissolved Duma. These men, mostly liberals from parties like the Cadets and Octobrists, were deeply alarmed by the collapse of imperial authority. They feared both anarchy and radical social revolution. They gathered as the Provisional Committee of the State Duma, hoping to create a temporary government that could restore order and manage the transition to something more stable. Thus, under one roof, two centers of power appeared overnight. On one side stood the delegates of the old educated society, claiming legal continuity and formal authority. On the other stood the delegates of the factories and the barracks, claiming moral legitimacy and the support of the streets. Without anyone planning it in advance, Russia had entered a new and delicate arrangement, the beginnings of what would come to be called dual power.
In the first days after the uprising, both sides recognized that they needed one another. The city needed trains to run, food to be distributed, and basic services to continue. On March 1st, an informal understanding was reached. The Duma's committee would form a provisional government, a cabinet that would be recognized by foreign powers and would handle day-to-day administration. The Soviet, for its part, would not overthrow this new government, for now. Instead, it would watch, criticize, and act as a guardian of the revolution from below. But this guardianship was not symbolic. The Soviet possessed something the provisional government did not: the loyalty of the soldiers in the capital. That loyalty was crystallized in one brief but powerful document, issued that same day to the Petrograd garrison, and soon known simply as Order No. 1. It instructed soldiers to elect committees in every unit, to discuss orders collectively, and, in political matters, to obey the provisional government only when its decrees did not contradict the decisions of the Soviet.
It also abolished some of the old forms of deference, telling soldiers they were citizens as well as servicemen, and that outside of duty hours, the traditional marks of rank and exaggerated courtesies could be dropped. The intention behind this order was clear. Never again should the government be able to use blind military obedience to crush a popular uprising, as it had in 1905. Soldiers were to be guardians of the revolution, not its executioners. But the effect was double-edged. By encouraging soldiers to see themselves as citizens in uniform, it also undermined the old habits of unquestioning obedience on which any army depends. In barracks and on parade grounds, officers quickly discovered that giving an order was no longer enough. They had to persuade, argue, and negotiate with their own men. The same four walls that had once echoed with shouted commands now echoed with debates and votes. Meanwhile, the new provisional government, formally established on March 2nd under the liberal Prince Georgy Lvov as prime minister, tried to show that it truly represented a break with the autocratic past. It announced a broad amnesty for political prisoners and exiles. Jails that had held revolutionaries now opened to release them. It removed legal restrictions based on class, religion, and nationality, promising that all citizens would be equal before the law. Old instruments of repression, such as the hated secret police, were abolished. Newspapers, long subject to strict censorship, began to print freely, and new titles appeared almost overnight, filling kiosks with voices and opinions that had never been allowed in public before. In the factories, workers elected committees to represent their interests. In many places, they negotiated for shorter working hours and safer conditions. In the villages, peasants formed their own committees and began to discuss how land might one day be redistributed, although the central government hesitated to take that step. Among national minorities, in Ukraine, Finland, the Baltic provinces, the Caucasus, new councils and congresses assembled, exploring the possibility of greater autonomy or even independence. After centuries of enforced silence and rigid hierarchy, Russia suddenly seemed full of meetings, assemblies, and councils. The air was thick with talk of freedom and justice. For a few weeks, people spoke of a honeymoon of the revolution. Strangers exchanged hopeful glances in the street. The hated word subject began to give way to the proud word citizen. Many believed that Russia might now follow a path similar to that of other European countries, evolving toward a parliamentary democracy with a constitution, rights, and elections. The provisional government promised to convene a constituent assembly, chosen by universal suffrage, to decide the ultimate shape of the state. Everything, they said, would be decided by this future gathering of the nation. And yet, beneath this hopeful surface, deep tensions remained. The revolution had toppled the Tsar in the matter of days, but it had not ended the war that had helped to fuel the uprising. At the front, soldiers continued to live and die in trenches. In the cities, queues still formed at dawn. The provisional government, mindful of Russia's alliances and fearful of losing its standing among the other great powers, insisted that the country must continue to fight until a satisfactory peace could be negotiated. Many in the Soviet, reflecting the mood of the workers and soldiers who had brought them to power, spoke instead of a democratic peace without annexations or punishments, a peace that would be reached through dialogue rather than victory on the battlefield. Historians later emphasized just how spontaneous the February uprising had been,
and how much it owed to the immediate experience of hunger and the brutal weariness of war. They point out that it was not a well-organized party that transformed protest into revolution, but the mutinies of soldiers on February 26th and 27th, soldiers who refused to continue firing on crowds and instead joined them. What began as a desperate struggle for bread became, within a few days, a struggle over the whole nature of power in Russia. In the midst of all this, Nicholas II himself was far from the city where his world was collapsing. He was at military headquarters in Mogilev, still trying to manage a war that was slipping out of his control. News of the disturbances in Petrograd reached him slowly, filtered through officials who underestimated the scale of what was happening. At first, he dismissed the unrest as another temporary outburst, something that could be sorted out. Orders were sent to loyal units to restore order in the capital. Those orders arrived too late, if they arrived at all. When the full scale of the mutinies and the breakdown of authority finally became clear, Nicholas decided to return to Petrograd and reassert his personal presence. But the railways were no longer his unquestioned servants. Railway workers, many of them sympathetic to the revolution, diverted the imperial train away from the capital. Instead of pulling into the familiar stations of the city he ruled, the Tsar's train was shunted to Pskov, a quieter town some 270 kilometers away. There, in a railway carriage surrounded by aides and a few loyal officers, Nicholas found himself strangely isolated, cut off from the people in whose name he still claimed to rule. One by one, the pillars of his regime now crumbled. Generals from the main fronts sent telegrams that no monarch ever wishes to receive. They informed him, respectfully but firmly, that the army could no longer be relied on to support him against the people. They warned that, to attempt to suppress the revolution by force would risk splintering the army completely and leaving the country defenseless. Political figures, including those who had served him faithfully in the Duma, echoed these messages. They told him in carefully chosen phrases that for the sake of the war effort and the survival of the state, he must consider stepping aside. It was a moment of profound personal and historical weight. Nicholas had been raised from childhood to see himself as the anointed ruler of all Russia, responsible before God for his people. Now, he was being told that in order to save what remained of the country, he had to give up the very role that defined his life. Late on March 2nd, 1917, still aboard his train, he signed the document that would end 3 centuries of Romanov rule, his abdication. In that act, there was one more twist. Nicholas did not abdicate only for himself. His son and heir, the young Tsarevich Alexei, suffered from hemophilia, a condition that made even minor injuries potentially life-threatening. The boy's health was fragile, and Nicholas could not bear the thought of separating him from his parents or placing such a burden on his weak shoulders. And so, instead of passing the throne directly to Alexei, Nicholas declared that the crown would go to his younger brother, Grand Duke Mikhail. But when Grand Duke Mikhail woke up the next morning to find himself, at least on paper, the new emperor, he found that the world
had already moved on. The provisional government, now in control in Petrograd, judged that trying to preserve the monarchy, even under a more liberal-minded figure, would be impossible. The mood in the capital had turned strongly against the very idea of a czar. Crowds were already tearing down imperial crests and portraits. In this atmosphere,
Michael understood that his authority would be little more than ink on a page. After consulting with political leaders, Michael issued a brief statement. He would accept the crown, he said, only if it were offered to him by the future Constituent Assembly, freely elected by the Russian people. In essence, he declined to rule unless the nation, speaking through a democratic process, explicitly asked him to do so. Given the temper of the times, that day never came. With that modest, cautious declaration, the Romanov dynasty, which had begun with another Michael in 1613, came to an end after 304 years. News of the abdication spread through Petrograd with a mixture of disbelief and exhilaration. People gathered in the streets and squares to listen to hastily printed proclamations being read aloud. Some wept with relief. Others laughed, embracing strangers. Imperial emblems were pulled down from public buildings. In front of the Duma, a huge crowd gathered to hear speeches, including one from Alexander Kerensky, a rising figure who moved easily between the Soviet and the new government. Standing before the throng, he called out, "Long live the Russian Republic!" and the words rolled over the crowd like a wave. In just a few days, something that had seemed immovable had vanished. The autocracy had fallen not through a carefully staged coup, but through a coming together of hardships and choices. Women who chose to march instead of waiting in line. Workers who chose to strike instead of enduring in silence. Soldiers who chose to turn their rifles away from the people. And a ruler who at last chose to sign his name on a document that unmade his own crown. The February Revolution accomplished, in a brief and chaotic week, what decades of cautious reform had not. It broke the spine of absolute monarchy in Russia. Yet in doing so, it opened a vast, uncertain space. The old structures of authority were gone, but the new ones were still fragile and undefined. Power now rested in an uneasy partnership between the Provisional Government and the Petrograd Soviet, between those who claimed legal continuity and those who claimed the voice of the streets. Their visions of the future did not fully align. One looked toward a liberal parliamentary order. The other held fast to the idea of a deeper social transformation. As winter slowly yielded to spring in 1917, Russians of all backgrounds, from peasants in distant villages to intellectuals in smoky Petrograd cafes, felt that they were living in extraordinary times. Anything seemed possible. A new Russia was being born, but no one yet knew what kind of country it would become. For the moment, there was only this: the heavy footsteps of an empire receding into the past, and the quieter, uncertain steps of a people learning for the first time to walk without a czar.
Chapter 4. Two Powers in One City. The Strange Spring of Dual Power, March, April, 1917. In the soft but unsettled weeks after the February Revolution, Russia found itself in a political landscape unlike anything it had ever known. Imagine a country standing in two beams of light at once, unable to decide which one would guide its path forward. This unusual situation came to be known as dual power, a balance so delicate that it felt as though the entire nation was breathing through two separate lungs. One source of authority was the Provisional Government, which emerged from the old Duma's leadership and was quickly accepted abroad as Russia's official government. It had the outward symbols of power, ministries, offices, and diplomatic recognition. Yet for all its formal authority, its connection to the people was surprisingly thin. As one observer put it, this government seemed to hover in the air, its power resting not on real control, but on permission granted by others. And that other was the Petrograd Soviet, a body with no legal status at all, yet immense influence. It spoke for workers and soldiers, and its decisions reverberated across factories, army regiments, and city streets. Even War Minister Alexander Guchkov admitted with startling honesty that the provisional government existed only as long as the Soviets allowed it to. In that single sentence, the fragility of the dual system came into view. One authority had legality, the other had loyalty. From the beginning, these two centers of power were animated by different dreams. The provisional government hoped to guide Russia toward a Western-style democracy, constitutional law, civil freedoms, and participation in the Great War alongside the Allies. Its supporters were mostly drawn from the educated and professional classes who had long opposed the Tsar's regime. The Soviets' heart beat to a different rhythm. Dominated in early spring by Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, it believed the moment demanded peace, land redistribution, and the protection of workers' rights. Its leaders insisted that Russia was still in the bourgeois stage of revolution, and that socialists should not yet seize full state power. For now, they would supervise rather than rule, allowing the provisional government to handle official duties. A choice rooted in theory, but fragile in practice. For such a delicate arrangement to survive, both sides needed trust and flexibility, and neither was available in abundance. This instability soon surfaced in a single dramatic document, Order No. 1, issued by the Petrograd Soviet on March 1. The order asked soldiers to choose committees within their units, to take control of their weapons, and to obey officers only when commands did not contradict Soviet decisions. It even abolished the old rituals of deference, erasing lofty titles and formal gestures of submission. Although created to protect the revolution from counterattack, the order sent a shockwave through the army. In an institution built on strict hierarchy, it introduced sudden democracy. Officers watched their authority dissolve. Commands became suggestions, sometimes even invitations, and soldiers increasingly treated orders as matters to be voted on. Guchkov, who had sounded confident in public, confided privately that the army was decomposing. It was a dramatic shift, and yet, to many revolutionaries, it felt like a necessary safeguard. The old fear of loyal troops crushing protests, as they had in 1905, still lingered in memory. Order No. 1 ensured that no such moment could happen again. Despite these tensions, the early weeks after the revolution carried a hopeful, almost spring-like energy. Historians sometimes call this period the honeymoon of the revolution. Russia seemed to exhale for the first time in generations. Overnight, censorship dissolved, political prisoners returned from Siberia, and newly freed individuals formed clubs, unions, and parties. Newspapers multiplied, and conversations that once had to be whispered could now be spoken openly. Workers negotiated 8-hour days. Minority groups across the empire, Ukrainians, Poles, peoples of the Caucasus and Baltic, revived their cultures and organized for autonomy. Even the land, long a source of peasant longing, began informally shifting into new hands as villages formed committees to reconsider the estates around them. For many, it felt like the country was blooming. But beneath this hopeful surface, tension was quietly building. Most soldiers and workers felt the war must end. Exhaustion ran deep. Years of battle, shortages, and grief had eroded any enthusiasm for continuing the fight. Yet Pavel Milyukov, the foreign minister, was determined to honor Russia's alliances. He believed that to step back now would ruin Russia's standing in the world. On April 18th, he sent a private note to the Allies reaffirming Russia's commitment to the conflict. When the note leaked, the reaction was explosive. For people who had risked everything to end the old regime, this felt like a betrayal. Crowds filled the streets with banners demanding Milyukov's removal. Soldiers, who had only just embraced the freedoms of the revolution, wondered why they were still expected to die for war aims that no longer made sense. The anger grew so fierce that Milyukov resigned, and moderate socialist leaders entered the government to steady public opinion. Yet the damage was done. The quiet harmony of March gave way to the arguments and rivalries of late April. The earlier unity dissolved into competing visions for Russia's future. Meanwhile, far from Petrograd, the revolution spread like ripples across a vast lake. In the countryside, long-standing frustrations rose to the surface. Peasants had heard that the Tsar was gone and believed, perhaps instinctively, that land would finally belong to those who worked it. They cut timber from once forbidden forests, grazed animals on noble lands, and in some regions seized estates outright. In national regions, Finland, Ukraine, Central Asia, old demands for autonomy and cultural revival resurfaced with new energy. Soldiers at the front, worn by endless battles, held meetings to discuss whether they would obey orders. Russia was becoming a patchwork of local revolutions, each responding to its own needs and hopes. All of these pressures weighed heavily on the provisional government, testing it from every direction. Workers wanted more control and better wages. Peasants wanted land and justice. Nations within the empire wanted cultural and political recognition. And hovering above it all was the question of the war, a conflict that consumed resources, lives, and the patience of an already exhausted people. Within the Soviet itself, divisions were deepening. Moderate socialists urged patience and cooperation with the government. More radical voices, including an increasingly confident Bolshevik contingent, argued that the government was failing at every turn. The atmosphere grew restless, as if the country were leaning forward, waiting for something to break. By April's end, many Russians felt that while the Tsar had fallen, the revolution had not yet granted what they needed most: peace, land, and bread. Those simple words echoed across the country, from factories, from trenches, from quiet village roads. They were a reminder that political theory and government decrees mattered little if hunger, war, and hardship remained. Dual power, with its two rival centers of authority, tried to walk two paths at once. One path promised liberal democracy and compromise. The other invited more radical transformation and the growing possibility of deeper conflict. But as an old Russian saying warned, one cannot ride two horses with a single saddle. By the end of April 1917, the arrangement that once seemed workable was beginning to buckle under the weight of its contradictions. Russia stood at a crossroads, with the future still uncertain and the true direction of the revolution still unresolved.
Chapter 5. The Man Who Came Back on the Sealed Train. Lenin's Return and the April Theses, 1917. In the cool, unsettled spring of 1917, As Russia stood between old worlds and new, one man was still far from home, listening to the echo of revolution through newspaper columns. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, the exiled leader of the Bolsheviks, sat in Zurich, Switzerland, in cramped rooms filled with books and papers,
devouring every scrap of news he could find about the February Revolution. He argued, paced, scribbled notes in the margins of newspapers, and spoke passionately to small circles of fellow émigrés in cafes and rented halls. Yet, even then, he confessed that he might never live to see a second revolution in Russia. Events were moving with a speed that surprised even a lifelong revolutionary. Then, history opened an unexpected door. Germany, locked in a brutal war with Russia, saw a strange opportunity. If Russia could be pushed deeper into turmoil, perhaps it would withdraw from the war altogether. And so, in a decision that would later seem almost surreal, the German authorities agreed to help transport Lenin and several dozen other exiles back to Russia. They provided a single railway carriage, carefully arranged so that Lenin and his companions would be physically isolated from the German population. The famous sealed train crossed the breadth of Germany like a moving paradox. Inside, a group of revolutionaries planning the future of Russia. Outside, a country at war, hostile to the state they sought to overthrow. The journey itself was tense, but strangely quiet. Lenin argued politics even in the confined space of the carriage, holding improvised lectures, discussing strategy, and insisting that the revolution in Russia must not stop halfway. As the train rattled towards the Baltic coast, he thought not in terms of exile and return, but in terms of opportunity and urgency. The old order in Russia had fallen. Something new could now be built. But what, and by whom? On April 3, 1917, according to the new calendar, March 21st in the old style still used in Russia, the train finally pulled in to the Finland station in Petrograd. A crowd of supporters, workers, soldiers, and party comrades had gathered. Red flags moved gently in the chilly air. Lenin stepped down from the carriage into a city that had changed beyond recognition since he had last seen it. The Tsar was gone. Street corners were filled with political posters and improvised speeches. Soviets of workers and soldiers debated day and night in smoky rooms. Climbing onto an armored car to address the crowd, Lenin spoke briefly but with intense clarity. He ended with a line that cut through the noise of the station. "Long live the worldwide socialist revolution." For many in that moment, his return felt like a turning point, even if its full meaning was not yet clear. When Lenin re-entered Russian politics, he walked into a movement that had already made its own cautious choices without him. In the weeks after the February Revolution, the Bolshevik leaders who had returned earlier, like Lev Kamenev and Joseph Stalin, had adopted a relatively moderate position. They supported the Petrograd Soviets' policy of conditional support for the provisional government, and even accepted the idea of continuing the war in a limited, defensive way. To them, the revolution was still in its bourgeois phase. Socialist power would have to wait. Lenin shattered this careful balance almost immediately. Just one day after his arrival, on April 4th, he presented a short but explosive set of proposals that would become known as the April Theses. 10 brief points, delivered in a firm, almost abrupt style, laid out a radically different path.
Where others saw a time for cooperation and gradual reform, Lenin saw an opening for a second, deeper revolution. At the heart of the April Theses was a simple, uncompromising idea. The provisional government must not be supported at all. It was, he argued, a government of capitalists and landlords committed to continuing an imperialist war and incapable of delivering what the people truly needed. Any hope that it might slowly evolve into a genuinely popular and peaceful regime he dismissed as illusion. Cooperation was not to be improved or refined. It was to be ended. In the language of that moment, Lenin was drawing a clear line: no compromise, no shared responsibility, no faith in a bourgeois state. In place of this government, Lenin proposed something startlingly new: all power to the Soviets. For him, the Soviets, the councils of workers and soldiers that had sprung up across the country, were not just advisory bodies or temporary organs of struggle. They were, or could become, the foundation of a new kind of state. In his vision, Russia would not pass through a long stage of parliamentary democracy before socialism. Instead, the Soviets themselves could be the organs of government, expressing directly the will of workers, soldiers, and peasants. Parliamentary institutions, with their elections every few years and their distance from everyday life, seemed to Lenin like an old road leading back towards compromise. The Soviets were to be something else, immediate, direct, and rooted in the experience of those who labored and fought. Lenin also spoke with unusual urgency about the war. He called it a predatory imperialist war, and insisted that Russia must seek peace at once, without annexations and without imposing financial punishments on other nations. This was not a cautious call for better diplomacy. It was a demand for a sharp break. To millions of soldiers in the trenches and families waiting anxiously back home, this message had a powerful emotional weight. They were tired of abstract promises and patriotic speeches. They wanted an end, a real end, to the killing. Then he turned to the land question, which lay like a deep wound beneath Russian society. Peasants across the empire had long dreamed of owning the soil they worked. They were already, in many places, seizing parts of noble estates, cutting timber, grazing animals, and taking control of fields. Lenin urged the Bolsheviks to embrace this process, not restrain it. Land, he argued, should pass into the hands of local peasant committees. It was a bold acknowledgement that the countryside was already moving ahead, and that the party must walk alongside it rather than try to pull it back. In the factories, too, Lenin anticipated profound changes. Although the April Theses did not spell out every detail, he hinted that workers should begin to control production through their committees, checking the decisions of managers and owners. Over time, this would, in his view, prepare the way for the nationalization of major industries under Soviet authority. In his mind, control of political power and control of economic life belonged together. He distilled all of these complex ideas into 3 short words that soon echoed across Russia: peace, land, and bread. Those words were not poetic slogans carefully crafted for style. They were direct answers to the 3 deepest anxieties of the time: peace for the soldiers and their families, land for the peasants, bread, a symbol of work, wages, and the basic means of survival, for the urban workers. In them, people heard not an abstract program, but a promise to address the wounds they carried in their daily lives. At first, even many Bolsheviks recoiled. Some thought Lenin had been away too long.
that he misunderstood the real situation. Kamenev and others accused him of being out of touch, proposing ideas that could isolate the party or plunge the country into chaos. They pointed out that most socialists still believed Russia had to pass through a period of liberal parliamentary development. To them, Lenin's call to leap beyond that stage seemed reckless. Yet Lenin did not retreat. He argued relentlessly inside the party, writing, speaking, and debating late into the night. He pointed not only to theory, but to lived reality. The continuing war, the hesitation of the provisional government, the rising impatience of workers and soldiers. Week after week, events outside the meeting rooms seemed to confirm his warnings. The government delayed reforms, the war continued, food remained scarce, hope frayed. Gradually, resistance within the party softened. By late April, at the Bolsheviks' 7th conference, Lenin's line prevailed. The party formally adopted the core of the April Theses as its program. That decision marked a quiet but profound
shift. From that moment on, the Bolsheviks no longer tried to pressure the provisional government into better policies. Instead, they prepared to replace it altogether in the name of the Soviets. The months that followed saw a steady rise in Bolshevik influence, especially in Petrograd. Their membership, only around 20-odd thousand in February, swelled several times over by June. In factories, at barracks, in neighborhood meetings and Soviet assemblies, Bolshevik speakers repeated the same themes with disciplined consistency. No trust in the provisional government, immediate peace, land for those who worked it, and real power for the Soviets. New figures returned from exile and jail to join this effort. Leon Trotsky, coming back from New York, at first stood somewhat apart, but soon found that his own views on the revolution's direction matched Lenin's more than anyone else's. By the summer, he would formally join the Bolsheviks, bringing with him great oratorical skill and experience in Soviet leadership. Joseph Stalin, more reserved in manner but increasingly active in organizational work, helped solidify the party's influence behind the scenes. Together with many lesser-known activists, they fanned out through factories and regiments, patiently explaining why half measures were failing and why a different path was needed. Bolshevik popularity grew not only because of their own energy, but also because of the visible shortcomings of their opponents. Each time the provisional government delayed land reform, failed to solve food shortages, or prepared new military offensives, it confirmed one of Lenin's arguments. To many workers and soldiers, the contrast became sharper with each passing week. One side spoke of treaties, prestige, and patience. The other spoke of immediate, concrete changes in their lives. By late spring, Petrograd had become a city of competing visions and restless expectations. Slogans filled the air, not only liberty and democracy, but now also all power to the Soviets. The question was no longer simply whether Russia would continue the revolution begun in February, but who would guide it and in what direction. The atmosphere, although often anxious and tense, also carried a strange sense of possibility. People argued in tramcars, in queues for bread, in soldiers' barracks and factory break rooms. The future felt close enough to touch, but its shape was still unclear. Lenin's return and the April Theses did not immediately remake Russia. Streets did not suddenly calm, and the government did not instantly fall. But they changed the vocabulary of the revolution. They offered a clear alternative to compromise at a time when compromise seemed to lead only to more war and more hardship. They polarized the landscape, drawing a sharper line between those who believed in gradual reform and those who believed the moment called for a decisive break. As spring turned toward summer, one fact slowly emerged. The Bolsheviks had staked everything on the deepest demands of the masses, and they were prepared to stand, without apology, as the party that refused to lower those demands. The echo of all power to the Soviets could now be heard not only in party meetings, but in the wider conversations of the city. The seed had been planted. How it would grow and what kind of harvest it would bring would be revealed in the turbulent months to come.
Chapter 6. The Summer Everything Boiled Over. The Kerensky Offensive and the July Days, 1917. By the time the soft light of early summer settled over Russia in 1917, the country was already deeply exhausted. Years of war had drained its strength, and beneath the surface of city streets and country roads, there was a sense that something vital was slipping away. Yet in this fragile moment, the provisional government decided to try one last effort at glory. Alexander Kerensky, now Minister of War, believed that a decisive victory might restore hope. He was a gifted speaker, intense and theatrical, and he spent the spring traveling from camp to camp along the front. Standing before rows of tired soldiers in muddy boots and worn uniforms, he appealed to their patriotism, to their sense of duty, and to the dream that the revolution and the war could somehow be reconciled. Some listened with shining eyes, others listened politely, but silently, thinking more of home than of heroism. The army that Kerensky addressed was not the same army that had marched willingly to war in 1914. Committees of soldiers now debated orders, and fraternization with enemy troops had become common. Men who had once been unquestioning instruments of command now saw themselves as citizens in uniform, entitled to discuss and decide. Even so, in late June 1917, the government launched what became known as the Kerensky Offensive, a large-scale attack in Galicia against German and Austro-Hungarian forces. At first, there were flashes of success. In some sectors, Russian troops advanced, perhaps stirred by Kerensky's fervor or by a final surge of revolutionary patriotism. For a brief moment, it seemed that the old spirit might return, that the army could still strike hard and surprise its enemies. But the foundation of discipline was too damaged to bear the strain. When the German and Austro-Hungarian counterattacks came, they struck an army that was already frayed. Units began to waver. Soldiers held hurried meetings on the very edge of the battlefield, raising their hands to vote on whether they would obey orders to attack. Others simply streamed away from the front, moving in small groups along the roads, heading toward villages that felt infinitely more real and important than the abstract idea of victory. One eyewitness recalled that the army no longer resembled a unified force, but a restless assembly where every command could be questioned. Within weeks, what had begun as a hopeful push turned into a disaster. The Central Powers drove the Russians back more than 150 miles, inflicting enormous losses. Estimates speak of up to 200,000 casualties, including tens of thousands killed and wounded, and many more captured or missing. The retreat was not only physical, it was psychological. Whatever will to fight remained in the Russian army was shattered. Desertions rose sharply as tens of thousands of men left the front, often carrying their rifles with them, determined never to return. The political impact of this failure was immense. Kerensky and the moderate socialist leaders who had supported the offensive had hoped to prove to Russia's allies and to their own people that revolution and war could coexist. Instead, the offensive stripped away the last illusions that a military victory might save the provisional government.
To many soldiers and workers, it confirmed what the Bolsheviks had been saying all along, that the war was hopeless, and that those who insisted on continuing it were betraying the people's longing for peace. One Bolshevik voice put it starkly, arguing that only traitors could insist on prolonging such suffering. As the summer advanced, the anger that had gathered in Petrograd found a sudden outlet. The failure of the offensive did not merely lower morale, it lit a fuse. In the first days of July, that fuse reached the powder. The immediate spark came from the 1st Machine Gun Regiment, an elite unit stationed in the capital. When their soldiers received orders to send detachments to the front, many of them saw it as a death sentence. They had watched the reports from Galicia, knew the reality of the front, and wanted no part in another doomed offensive. On July 3rd, they mutinied. What began with one regiment quickly drew in others. Radicalized workers, already restless after months of shortages and strain, joined them. From the nearby naval base of Kronstadt, sailors who had long been among the most revolutionary elements in the armed forces traveled to the city, armed and determined. Together, they poured into the streets of Petrograd. This time, it was not a desperate search for bread that drove people out of their homes, but clear political demands. Banners and shouted slogans filled the air. All power to the Soviets, and down with the 10 capitalist ministers. The crowds moved toward the towered palace, where both the Petrograd Soviet and the Provisional Government had their seats. For 3 intense days, from July 3rd to July 5th, the capital was gripped by uncertainty. Outside the palace, armed demonstrators demanded that the Soviets' Executive Committee, led largely by Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, take power at once. Many of those in the crowd believed that the time for compromise had passed, and that the Soviets should replace the provisional government entirely. Inside, the Soviet leaders hesitated. They feared that a sudden seizure of power in Petrograd, without firm support in the rest of the country, would plunge Russia into chaos and invite counter-revolution. The Bolsheviks themselves were caught between caution and responsibility. Lenin and his close associates understood that the conditions for a successful nationwide takeover were not yet in place. Their party was stronger in the capital than elsewhere, and many Soviets beyond Petrograd were still dominated by more moderate socialists. Yet on the streets, ordinary workers and soldiers looked to the Bolsheviks for guidance. If the party told them to go home, it risked appearing timid or even conservative. If it urged them forward, it risked leading them into defeat. In the end, the Bolsheviks chose a middle course. They joined the demonstrations to give them some direction and to prevent them from turning into chaotic violence, but they did not openly call for an attempt to seize power. Lenin would later describe these events as a semi-insurrection, a movement that went beyond normal protest but stopped short of a fully planned revolution. It was, in his eyes, premature. The Provisional Government, still formally headed by Prince Georgy Lvov, with Kerensky as its most visible figure, responded by gathering loyal troops. Many soldiers in Petrograd, including some who had recently shown sympathy for Bolshevik ideas, hesitated. They were uneasy about firing on fellow soldiers and workers, but they also were not ready to follow an uprising that the Soviet itself refused to endorse. That hesitation mattered. On July 4th, the tension turned into open clashes. Shots were exchanged near Nevsky Prospect, one of Petrograd's main avenues. People fell in the streets. There were deaths on both sides, though the number of those killed remained in the dozens rather than the hundreds. Even so, the sense of threat and instability deepened. At this fragile moment, the government chose to strike at the Bolsheviks' reputation in a different way. Newspapers suddenly published documents, some genuine and others falsified, suggesting that Lenin and his party were receiving money and instructions from Germany. The story, later known as the Exposure Affair, painted him as a foreign agent sent to destroy Russia from within. The details were folded into a dramatic narrative involving secret channels and hidden funds, and the effect on public opinion was immediate. Many soldiers and civilians, already suspicious and fearful, began to see the Bolsheviks not just as radicals, but as possible traitors. As reinforced troops loyal to the government arrived from the front and learned of these accusations, their anger burned hot. They had just endured the failure of the offensive and the agony of retreat. To be told that Russian radicals were acting in concert with the enemy sharpened their mood. The balance in the streets shifted. By July 4th and 5th, the government forces, supported by pro-government elements in the Soviet, managed to disperse the demonstrators. The July uprising, for all its energy, collapsed. The aftermath was harsh. Lvov stepped aside, and on July 8th, Kerensky became prime minister, placing his name firmly at the top of the state. He moved quickly to take advantage of the moment. Arrest warrants were issued for Bolshevik leaders. Lenin, now under direct threat, disguised himself with a wig and spectacles and fled Petrograd, eventually finding refuge in Finland. From that temporary exile, he continued to write and reflect, working on theoretical texts such as State and Revolution, even as he waited for another opening to return. Other leading Bolsheviks were not as fortunate. Leon Trotsky, Lev Kamenev, and many others were arrested and imprisoned. Party newspapers were shut down. Printing presses were smashed. Pravda, the Bolshevik daily,
was silenced. For a time, it seemed as though the party might be broken beyond repair, its organization shattered, and its leaders scattered or jailed. On the surface, the July days seemed to mark the end of what had been called dual power. In the wake of the uprising, Kerensky's government declared a state of emergency and claimed extraordinary powers. The influence of the Petrograd Soviet diminished for a while, as many workers and soldiers felt let down by its refusal to take decisive action. Leaders of the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries who had condemned the July demonstrations entered the government in a new coalition that excluded many cadet ministers, some of whom had resigned over questions of national autonomy, especially regarding Ukraine. Kerensky moved into the Winter Palace, the old residence of the Tsars, and presented himself as the protector of the revolution against both anarchy and foreign intrigue. In early September, by government decree, Russia was formally declared a republic, a symbolic gesture meant to sever the final ties with monarchy and to give a clearer shape to the new order. Yet this gesture could not hide the depth of the crisis. Beneath this appearance of restored authority, new dangers were gathering strength. On the right, army officers, conservative politicians, and important sections of the propertied classes watched the July turmoil and the government's hesitant response with alarm. To them, the events in Petrograd confirmed their worst fears. Discipline in the army was collapsing. Land seizures were spreading in the countryside, and radicals in the cities were pushing for ever more sweeping change. They called ever more loudly for a firm hand, for the restoration of strict military discipline, and for a crackdown on socialist influence in all its forms. On the left, the Bolsheviks took stock of what had happened. They had suffered a serious setback. Their leaders were persecuted, their press suppressed, and their reputation damaged by accusations of treachery. Yet they also drew lessons from the failure. They understood more clearly that a successful revolution would need broader support across Russia, in cities and garrisons far beyond Petrograd, and that the timing of an insurrection mattered as much as the strength of slogans. The July days became a kind of dress rehearsal, a powerful warning about the dangers of moving too soon. The summer of 1917, taken as a whole, marked a turning point in the Russian Revolution. The collapse of the Kerensky offensive destroyed any remaining hope that the provisional government could draw strength from the battlefield. The July uprising revealed both the depth of popular impatience and the cost of premature action. The government, in response, stepped to the right, increasing repression against the Bolsheviks, even as forces further to the right began to dream of a more thorough restoration of order under strong military leadership. For ordinary workers, soldiers, and peasants, these months deepened a growing conviction. Many began to feel that the so-called compromisers in the moderate socialist parties had failed to keep their promises. They had remained tied to the bourgeoisie, continued the war, and stood aside in moments when decisive change seemed possible. Lenin's uncompromising insistence on peace, land, and real power for the Soviets, once dismissed by many as too extreme, now sounded less like a distant ideal and more like a clear alternative. In the chapters that follow, the story will move toward the confrontation that this summer prepared. The shock of military defeat, the bitter memory of the July days, the tightening grip of the government, and the restless anger within society would all shape the next dramatic turns of 1917. For now, as summer gives way to autumn in this narrative, Russia drifts into a tense and uneasy twilight, with the balance of power still unsettled and the final outcome not yet written.
Chapter 7. The General Who Marched Too Far. The Kornilov Scare, and How It Saved the Bolsheviks, August 1917. In the late summer of 1917, the mood in Russia shifted once again. The streets of Petrograd, which only weeks before had echoed with the confusion and anger of the July days, now felt strangely tense and expectant. The Bolsheviks had been driven underground, their leaders jailed or in hiding. Many of the moderate socialists, who had tied their fortunes to the provisional government, seemed tired and compromised. Into that atmosphere of uncertainty stepped a very different sort of figure. A hard, angular cavalry general named Kornilov. To many among Russia's frightened elites, Kornilov looked less like a man and more like an answer. He was a war hero, a man who had escaped German captivity, who radiated discipline and personal courage. At a time when the front was collapsing, when the countryside was aflame with peasant land seizures, and when workers in the cities were pushing for more control in the factories, the propertied classes and the army high command longed for order. They spoke in anxious tones about the danger of anarchy, of the revolution going too far, and of the specter of Bolshevik power in Petrograd. It was easy in such a climate to imagine Kornilov as a kind of Russian Napoleon, a strong hand who would restore discipline, quiet the streets, and push back the tide of revolution. By late July and early August, this dream hardened into a political project. Officers, conservatives in the Duma, business circles, and landowners began to rally to Kornilov. Newspapers sympathetic to the right praised his firmness. In private, influential men whispered that the country could not be saved by talkers and lawyers, but only by soldiers. The general himself did not hide his views. He called openly for severe measures, the reintroduction of the death penalty at the front, which the revolution had abolished, the curbing or even dissolution of the Petrograd Soviet, and the removal of agitators and political troublemakers from the army. Behind those proposals lay a clear intention. Kornilov hoped to roll back much of the democratic transformation that had swept through the army, and, by extension,
to restore a more authoritarian order across Russia. For those who feared the revolution, this sounded like salvation. For those who had risked everything to topple the Tsar, it sounded like the first notes of a counter-revolutionary march. Caught between these worlds stood Alexander Kerensky. Kerensky, who only months earlier had seemed to embody the romantic hopes of the revolution, young, eloquent, a lawyer who could move crowds to tears, now found himself in almost an impossible position. As prime minister, he needed the support of the generals and the propertied classes to keep the war going and the state functioning. But he also depended on the moderate socialists and the Soviets to maintain legitimacy among workers and soldiers. In early August, trying to pull these fraying strands together, Kerensky convened a state conference in Moscow. It was meant to be a great display of national unity, a place where representatives of all major groups, except the boycotting Bolsheviks, would pledge to save the country together. What the conference actually revealed was how deeply divided Russia had become. When Kornilov appeared, the hall shook with applause from business and military delegates. They saw in him the strong, reassuring shape of restored authority. By contrast, when socialist speakers took the podium, the mood turned cold or openly hostile. They were met with silence, heckling, even boos. The gathering made it painfully clear that the right was increasingly bold and united, while the left, especially the moderates, seemed on the defensive. Beneath the formal speeches and declarations, a confrontation was quietly shaping up. It came to the surface at the end of August. By then, the situation in and around Petrograd looked dire. German forces had taken Riga, moving closer to the capital. Strikes were resurging. Bolshevik influence in the Petrograd Soviet, though officially under a cloud after the July days, was once again on the rise. Rumors flew that a Bolshevik coup was imminent. At the same time, the army continued to disintegrate, its discipline eaten away by years of war and months of revolution. In this atmosphere, Kornilov made his move. On August 24, he ordered units of loyal troops, including the 3rd Cavalry Corps under command General Krimov, to advance on Petrograd. He claimed this was necessary to save the provisional government from radicals and from the German threat. But the sight of troops marching toward the capital under the command of a general who had spoken so openly about restoring iron discipline and clipping the wings of the Soviets looked to many like the beginning of a military coup. Kerensky suddenly realized that the man he had helped elevate might try to overtake him. On August 27, he dismissed Kornilov as commander-in-chief and publicly accused him of plotting to overthrow the government. Kornilov refused to accept the dismissal and continued to send his troops forward. Whatever misunderstandings or mixed signals had existed between them were now irrelevant. In practice, the supreme commander of the army was marching against the civilian authorities. It was a terrifying moment. The provisional government had very few reliable troops inside Petrograd. Many units had been sent to the front. Those that remained were politically divided and deeply tired of war. The government, which only weeks earlier had crushed the July days and declared a state of emergency, suddenly found itself almost defenseless. And so Kerensky turned, in desperation, to the very forces he had recently repressed. He appealed to the Petrograd Soviet. He appealed to the workers' militias, the Red Guards where Bolshevik influence was strong. He ordered Bolshevik leaders released from prison so that they could help organize the city's defense. Leon Trotsky walked out of jail. Other militants emerged from the underground. The government that had denounced them as traitors now needed their help to save the revolution. The Bolsheviks understood immediately what this moment meant. Here, at last,
was a clear, visible embodiment of the danger they had been warning about. A general of the old school, surrounded by conservative supporters, moving troops toward the revolutionary capital under the banner of order. They framed Kornilov as a new tyrant in all but name, a man who would strangle the gains of 1917 and restore the old oppression. Agitators from the Petrograd Soviet and Bolshevik organizations fanned out to meet Kornilov's advancing troops. They did not attack them with artillery, they approached with speeches, leaflets, and whispered conversations in railway sidings and village squares. They told the soldiers that the trains were not carrying them to defend the revolution, but to crush it. They reminded them of February, of the days when they had refused to shoot at the people. In many cases, the messages found a receptive audience. These soldiers, too, were peasants and workers in uniform. They were weary of the war, suspicious of the officer corps, and wary of being used. Just as important were the railway workers. Sympathetic to the Soviets and wary of any move toward dictatorship, they took matters into their own hands. Trains carrying Kornilov's men were delayed, diverted onto side tracks, or left without fuel. Telegraph lines went dead. Orders from headquarters arrived late, or never. An army that depended on railways and telegraphs suddenly found its lifelines quietly cut by the very people who maintained them. Over the course of a few days, the momentum of Kornilov's march simply evaporated. Units halted, confused, and then began to disintegrate. Some soldiers mutinied outright. Others stayed on the trains, but refused to move further. General Krimov eventually reached Petrograd almost alone. Seeing that the coup had failed, he took his own life. Kornilov was arrested on September 1. What might have become a bloody civil war in August ended with remarkably little fighting. Yet the political consequences were enormous. For Kerensky, the affair was a disaster. He presented himself as the man who had saved the revolution from a right-wing general. But many could see that his own earlier maneuvers, his attempts to appease the right while also courting the left, had helped create the crisis in the first place. Some evidence suggested he had initially encouraged Kornilov's toughness, only to recoil when he realized just how far the general intended to go. In his later memoirs, Kerensky himself admitted that he had been forced to call upon the Soviets and leftist forces to stop Kornilov, and that this decision, while necessary in the moment, fatally weakened his standing. To the conservative classes and many officers, Kerensky now appeared as a traitor who had betrayed the army's commander and thrown himself into the arms of radicals. To workers and soldiers on the left, he seemed like a man who had toyed with counter-revolution until his hand was forced. As one liberal politician sighed bitterly, Kerensky had disgraced himself with all factions. His government still existed, but its moral and political authority had drained away. The Bolsheviks, by contrast, emerged from the Kornilov affair transformed. Only weeks before, they had been hounded as German agents, their leaders imprisoned, their newspapers shut. Now, in factories and barracks, people remembered who had warned of the danger of generals and order at gunpoint. They remembered who had taken up the task of defending Petrograd when the government seemed paralyzed. In the words of one sympathetic observer, there was suddenly a revulsion toward the Bolsheviks no longer, but a revulsion in their favor, a realization that they had been the only ones to clearly warn and arm the people against Kornilov's threat. Soviet elections in September told the story in numbers as well as feelings. In one city after another, Bolshevik candidates gained ground. In Petrograd, the
the Soviet elected Leon Trotsky as its chairman on September 5th, placing a Bolshevik at the head of the capital's most important revolutionary body. The Moscow Soviet also shifted into Bolshevik hands later that month. Lenin, still hiding in Finland and following developments through reports and letters, wrote with scarcely contained excitement that power was slipping from the hands of the old rulers and gathering in the Soviets, where his party was now strong. There was another change, quieter, but perhaps even more significant. Because Kerensky had authorized the arming of the Red Guards to confront Kornilov, large numbers of rifles and machine guns now rested in the hands of workers and soldiers close to the Bolsheviks. In the fevered days of late August and early September, many factories and neighborhoods formed or rebuilt their own militias. The Red Guards, previously loosely organized and often poorly armed, grew into a more substantial force, and Bolshevik organizers moved systematically to influence and guide them. At the same time, within the Petrograd Soviet, a new body was created to oversee the city's defense, the Military Revolutionary Committee. It was a practical step, justified by the need to coordinate forces against any future threat. But in the hands of determined revolutionaries, it would soon become something more, an institutional lever capable of moving the political balance of the capital. All of this deepened the polarization of Russian politics. After Kornilov, there was very little middle ground left. Moderate socialists, Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries had been discredited in the eyes of many workers and soldiers. They had taken part in governments that continued the war and flirted with military strongmen, and then they had failed to prevent the near coup. On the other side, liberal cadets and conservatives moved further to the right, speaking openly about restoring strict discipline, considering monarchist solutions, or looking again to generals. More and more, the political landscape narrowed to a stark contrast: Kerensky's weakening provisional government versus the rising Bolshevik alternative. Yet Kerensky no longer commanded deep loyalties, while the Bolsheviks, in many crucial areas, now had both influence and arms. Beyond the capitals, the same currents were at work in a different form. In the countryside, peasants continued to seize land, cut timber, and divide estates, often in defiance of official orders. In the army, soldiers were increasingly unwilling to fight, but deeply eager for peace and for a clear end to the chaos. In the cities, workers faced shortages, unemployment, and the disintegration of the old economy. For many, the Kornilov affair confirmed a simple lesson: the old ruling classes and their generals would not hesitate to crush the revolution if given the chance. If the gains of 1917 were to be protected, someone had to confront that threat decisively. That someone, in the eyes of growing numbers of ordinary people, was now the Bolshevik Party. In this way, the attempted right-wing coup of August 1917 did something remarkable and unintended. It strengthened the very forces that most feared it, and it weakened those who thought they could balance between revolution and reaction. By exposing the willingness of conservative elites and parts of the army to use force against the new order, it made the Bolshevik warnings seem not extreme, but prophetic. From September onward, the initiative in the revolution increasingly lay with the left, and above all with the Bolsheviks. Lenin, watching from the shadows, began to argue that the time to seize power was approaching. But that story, with all its tension and careful preparation, belongs to the next chapter. For now, it is enough to see the summer of 1917 for what it was: a season in which a general's march on Petrograd failed to restore law and order, and instead breathed new life into a radical movement
that would soon reshape Russia and much of the world in ways few could yet imagine.
Chapter 8. The Night They Took the Palace. The October Revolution, 1917. By the autumn of 1917, Russia felt like a vast country running on empty. The old provisional government, born from the February Revolution with so much hope, now struggled just to be heard. Its decrees often went no further than the walls of its offices. Beyond Petrograd, peasants were no longer waiting for laws to change. They were taking the land themselves, cutting timber from noble forests, dividing fields, and burning manor houses that had towered over their villages for generations. At the front, what had once been an army had become a weary mass of men in uniform, longing to go home. Desertion was no longer a rare act of desperation. It was an everyday decision. Whole units held meetings to decide whether they would obey orders. Many simply walked away, rifles on their shoulders, heading back to their villages. In the cities, life narrowed down to queues and shortages. Factory chimneys that had once symbolized industrial strength now stood cold and still because there was no coal, no oil, and no raw materials. Workshops closed their doors, wages lost their meaning in the face of rising prices, and the daily bread ration shrank until people woke up wondering not about politics or ideology, but about how to find enough food for the day. It was into this exhausted, frayed landscape that the Bolsheviks stepped forward with a simple, insistent message: all power to the Soviets. Lenin, the driving mind behind the party, was still living semi-clandestinely in Finland, hiding from the government that had branded him a traitor. Yet from that relative isolation, he bombarded his comrades with letters full of urgency. Over and over, he pressed the same point. The moment was slipping away, and history would not be kind if they failed to act when the balance of forces had tilted in their favor. In one of these messages, he warned that history would not forgive the Bolsheviks if they hesitated now. It was his way of saying that, in times like these, delay could be a kind of betrayal. Inside the party, however, there was hesitation. Some senior Bolsheviks, such as Lev Kamenev and Grigory Zinoviev, argued that the wisest path was to wait for the upcoming elections to the Constituent Assembly. Let the people vote, they insisted. If the Bolsheviks were truly the voice of the masses, that would soon become clear. They feared that a premature uprising could isolate the party, provoke a backlash, and plunge Russia into chaos even deeper than the chaos already unfolding. But others saw that events in the streets were moving faster than any legal timetable. Leon Trotsky, who now chaired the Petrograd Soviet and had become one of the most gifted orators of the revolution, believed the Soviets themselves could provide the legitimacy that the Bolsheviks needed. A second All-Russian Congress of Soviets was scheduled for late October. If an uprising could be timed so that the Congress met at the very moment power changed hands, then the transfer could be presented not as a narrow party coup, but as the Soviets themselves taking charge of the country. This was the thread of logic that eventually tied Lenin's impatience to Trotsky's strategy. On October 10, 1917, in a secret meeting of the Bolshevik Central Committee, this question was finally put to a vote. In a tense, clandestine session, 10 members voted in favor of preparing an armed uprising. Only Kamenev and Zinoviev voted against. The exact date was left open, but the outline was clear. The uprising would be synchronized with the opening of the Soviet Congress. The new government would be proclaimed in its name,
giving the impression that the revolution was the natural expression of the Soviets' will. Still, nothing about the situation was simple. In Petrograd and Moscow, the Bolsheviks had gained real strength in the Soviets, but across Russia, the picture was mixed. Many provincial Soviets were still led by socialist revolutionaries or Mensheviks, socialists who opposed a Bolshevik monopoly on power and feared the consequences of a radical leap toward socialism. And the provisional government, though weakened, was not blind. Alexander Kerensky, now head of the government, knew the Bolsheviks posed a mortal threat. He tried, in small ways, to contain them, transferring radical regiments out of Petrograd, attempting to shut down Bolshevik newspapers, and denouncing the party in speeches. These measures, however, were neither strong enough to crush the Bolsheviks, nor subtle enough to calm the situation. Instead, they helped create the atmosphere the Bolsheviks needed, allowing them to frame their preparations as a defensive act. They would claim they were protecting the Soviets and the revolution from a government sliding toward repression. Out of this tension emerged one of the most important institutions of the October days, the Military Revolutionary Committee of the Petrograd Soviet, often simply called the MRC. Publicly, the MRC was created to coordinate the defense of Petrograd against external threats, especially the possibility of a renewed German attack or another attempt at a right-wing coup like the one General Kornilov had tried to mount in August. In practice, the committee became something else, a quiet, careful nerve center for the coming insurrection. Chaired by Trotsky, the MRC drew in Bolsheviks and left-wing socialist revolutionaries who were willing to work alongside them. Their members began the patient work of turning sympathy into structure. They sent representatives, or commissars, to military units throughout the city, to factories, to the main railway stations, and to other points of strategic importance. Their mission was to ask a simple question. When the moment came, who would you obey, the fading provisional government or the Soviets? The mood among the rank-and-file soldiers made the answer more and more predictable. Many remembered the waste and bloodshed of the failed June offensive, and they had watched with suspicion as generals and politicians talked about restoring discipline while their own lives grew harder. The attempt by Kornilov to march troops on Petrograd had confirmed their fear that the old order might yet return in military form. Now, when emissaries of the Petrograd Soviet came asking for loyalty, many units responded by declaring that they recognized the authority of the MRC over that of the government. By late October, reports from the garrison painted a stark picture. The provisional government could rely on a handful of units, some officer cadets, a few Cossacks, and the women volunteers of the so-called Women's Battalion. They stood guard in gilded halls and long corridors, aware that the city beyond the palace walls was slipping from their grasp. At the same time, the Red Guards, militias formed from armed workers, were gaining confidence and structure. Young men who had once labored in the factories of the Vyborg district now spent their evenings drilling with rifles in courtyards and workshop yards. They were poorly uniformed and unevenly trained, but their sense of purpose was strong. Many of them had been on the front line of strikes and demonstrations. Now they were preparing for something larger and more decisive. On October 20th, Lenin quietly slipped back into Petrograd in disguise, determined to be present when the decisive step was taken. 2 days later, Russian intelligence reports were already noting the grim reality. The city's garrison, they admitted, would not fight for the government. The time, it seemed, had come. The uprising itself, when it began, did not look like the dramatic storm of barricades that later paintings and films would suggest. It unfolded instead with an almost eerily calm, like a city slowly changing hands in the night. On the evening of October 24th, Old Style, detachments of Red Guards and sympathetic soldiers moved out under the orders of the Military Revolutionary Committee of the Petrograd Soviet. Their targets were not crowds or symbols, but the quiet machinery of modern power. Telephone stations, telegraph offices, railway hubs, bridges, power plants, and government buildings. Some units went to the central telephone exchange, where lines linked ministries and offices. Others approached the telegraph office, through which messages traveled across the empire and to foreign governments. More
detachments took control of the main railway stations, knowing that if those remained in government hands, loyal units might be brought in from outside. Bridges over the Neva River were also seized to prevent any movement of hostile forces between different parts of the city. These operations faced surprisingly little resistance. Many guards on duty had already sworn loyalty to the Soviet, and those who had not often chose not to risk their lives for a government that seemed to be fading away. By dawn on October 25, the key nodes of Petrograd's infrastructure were in the hands of the insurrectionists. The city woke to a new reality. Red flags hung where imperial eagles had been, and government troops were nowhere to be seen. Kerensky, sensing the danger, left the city in a desperate attempt to gather loyal forces. In a now famous scene, he borrowed a car from the American embassy and drove away from a capital he no longer controlled, hoping to find Cossack units that might still support him. Inside Petrograd, the remaining ministers of the provisional government withdrew to the Winter Palace. Once the shimmering symbol of imperial autocracy, it now became a besieged island of a government in decline. Their defenders were few. Some young officer cadets, loyal more to their profession than to any ideology, and the women of a volunteer battalion who had stepped forward earlier that year to shame the men into returning to the fight. They stood guard in gilded halls and long corridors, aware that the city beyond the palace walls was slipping from their grasp. That evening, on the dark waters of the Neva, the cruiser Aurora lay at anchor, her crew aligned with the Bolshevik cause. At a prearranged moment, she fired a blank shell, a symbolic signal that the final stage of the insurrection should begin. The boom echoed over the river and the city, more a gesture than an act of destruction, but its sound has passed into history. Columns of Red Guards and soldiers moved toward the Winter Palace. Their advance was steady rather than dramatic. Inside, the defenders had little appetite for a doomed stand. There were some exchanges of fire and scattered violence, but nothing on the scale of a battlefield. By the early hours of October 26th, the palace was taken. The ministers of the provisional government were found together and arrested, their power reduced to words on now irrelevant paper. Despite the later legend of a fierce battle, the actual human cost of this seizure of power in Petrograd was limited. Historians estimate that the number of casualties was small, closer to what might be seen in a single day of unrest than in a great civil conflict. In this sense, the October Revolution in the capital was less an explosion and more a carefully orchestrated replacement of one authority by another. While these events unfolded around the Winter Palace, a parallel drama was taking place at the Smolny Institute, a former school for noble girls that had become the nerve center of the revolution. There, the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets opened on the evening of October 25, gathering delegates from workers' and soldiers' councils across the country. When news reached the hall that the provisional government had effectively been overthrown, the reaction was sharply divided. Mensheviks and right-wing socialist revolutionaries rose in anger, denouncing the Bolshevik action as an illegitimate coup. They argued that the Soviets had never been meant to be instruments of one party's rule, and they refused to endorse the armed seizure of power. In protest, many of them walked out. As they left, Trotsky delivered a bitter farewell, telling them that their role in the revolution was over, and that they belonged, in his famous phrase, on the dustbin of history. It was a harsh choice of words, reflecting the raw tensions inside the revolutionary camp. With the moderates gone, the balance of the Congress shifted decisively. The remaining delegates were largely Bolsheviks or their allies from the left socialist revolutionaries. In the early hours of October 26th, Lenin appeared before them in person. For many, it was the first time they had seen him since his months in hiding. Calmly, almost quietly, he announced that the provisional government had been deposed and that power had passed to the Soviets. The Congress then moved quickly. It approved a series of key decrees, one calling for an immediate armistice and a peace without annexations or indemnities, another declaring that landed estates would be turned over to peasant committees. These measures did not come out of nowhere. They were the formal expression of demands that had been rising from below for months: peace, land, and bread, now written into the first documents of the new regime. To give these decisions a permanent form, the Congress created a new executive body, the Council of People's Commissars, known in Russian as Sovnarkom. Lenin became its chairman. Around him sat other Bolsheviks, who would soon become familiar names in the history of the new state. Later, Lenin would say with satisfaction that the October Revolution had been carried out with the precision and smoothness of clockwork. In Petrograd, at least, there was some truth in this description. The careful preparation by the Military Revolutionary Committee, the sympathy of the garrison, the presence of armed and organized workers, and the weakness of the government combined to make the change of power relatively swift
and muted. But everyone involved knew that the hardest part was still to come. Petrograd was only one city, and Russia was a vast empire with many regions and fronts still in turmoil. The new government would have to extend its authority beyond the capital, manage the expectations of workers and peasants who believed their lives were about to improve, and find a way to withdraw from a devastating war without inviting foreign occupation. Beneath the calm of that October night lay the shadows of civil war, famine, and prolonged conflict. For the moment, though, as the pale light of October 26th spread over the river and rooftops of Petrograd, a sense of extraordinary change hung in the air. 3 revolutions, in 1905, in February 1917, and now in October, had reshaped the destiny of Russia in just over a decade. A centuries-old monarchy had fallen. A short-lived provisional experiment had collapsed. A new, radical government had taken its place. On that morning, it was still possible, at least for some, to believe that a new world might be built out of the ruins of the old. Whether that world would bring liberation or a different kind of oppression remained unwritten. But the era of Bolshevik rule had begun, and with it a new chapter, not only in Russian history, but in the history of the 20th century itself.
Chapter 9. First Steps of a New World. The Early Decrees and the Fate of the Constituent Assembly, 1917 to 1918. If you close your eyes for a moment and picture Petrograd in early November 1917, you might imagine a city that has just passed through a storm. The winds of October have settled for a while. The Winter Palace has fallen. The provisional government has vanished from the stage, and in its place, a new authority has quietly taken up residence in the old Smolny Institute. This new authority calls itself the Council of People's Commissars, or Sovnarkom. The name is unfamiliar, almost awkward, but that is part of the point. The new rulers do not want to sound like ministers of a traditional government. They want to sound like something different, something born from the Soviets and from the revolution itself. Yet beneath the unfamiliar titles lies a very old problem: how to govern a vast, exhausted country that is falling apart. The task is immense. Russia is still formally at war. Its army is dissolving at the front. Its railways are breaking down. Its factories are short of coal and raw materials. And in the countryside, the ancient question of the land, who owns it and who works it, is being answered by fire and the plow without waiting for any law. The Bolsheviks understand that if they want to hold power, they must respond quickly and decisively to the deepest desires that have carried them into office. They cannot wait to draft a full constitution or build a careful bureaucracy. They need to speak directly to soldiers, to peasants, and to workers in words that are concrete and immediate. And so, in their first days in power, they reach for a simple tool: the decree. These first decrees are short documents, but their effects are enormous. Each one is like a stone dropped into the still water of a weary society, sending rings of consequence spreading outwards. The first stone is the decree on peace. For 3 long years, Russia has been caught in the machinery of the First World War. Millions of men have passed through the trenches. Too many have not returned. The front lines stretch from the Baltic to the Black Sea, a scar across the map. By late 1917, most soldiers are no longer moved by patriotic slogans or promises of victory. They dream of home, of familiar fields and quiet evenings. In villages, wives and mothers line up for bread, wondering whether those they love are still alive. When the new government announces, almost immediately, that it is calling for an armistice and a peace without annexations and without indemnities, it is as if it has spoken directly to this fatigue. The decree does not magically end the war overnight. There will still be negotiations, tensions, and a long, difficult process that leads towards a separate peace. But the moral direction is unmistakable. The new rulers are telling soldiers and the world that Russia will no longer fight for imperial ambitions, no longer accept a war of conquest, and no longer send its people to die for the balance of power in Europe. At the front, men read the text of the decree in trenches lit with dim candles or smoky lamps. Some do not believe it at first, or think it is propaganda. Others feel a quiet wave of relief. It does not immediately solve the chaos of desertions or the fear of enemy advances, but it changes the horizon. Instead of more offensives, more failed orders, and more retreats, they now glimpse the possibility of laying down arms with some sense of dignity. In Russia's former allies, the reaction is very different. Leaders in Paris and London read the decree with anger and alarm. For them, Russia has been part of a great alliance, a partner in an enormous struggle. To hear that the new government in Petrograd wants to step away from this war feels like betrayal. But the Bolsheviks are not writing this decree for Allied cabinets. They are writing it for the people who fill the trenches and queue in the streets. In this way, the decree on peace is both a promise and a signal. It is a promise to the Russian people that their sacrifices will not be stretched indefinitely into the future. It is a signal that this new government is willing to break with older rules of international loyalty if those rules demand more blood. Almost immediately alongside it comes the decree on land. In many ways, this decree does not create something new. Instead, it legalizes what is already happening in the countryside. For generations, peasants have worked land owned by nobles, the church, and the crown. They have paid rents, dues, and taxes, watched others claim the best fields, and dreamed of the day when the land would belong to those who actually tilled it. That dream has grown sharper in the years of war and revolution. By the autumn of 1917, villages across Russia have already begun to act. Estate forests are cut. Manor houses are looted or burned. Boundaries are redrawn by local committees. The earth is being reclaimed, not by decree, but by direct action. The Bolsheviks know this. They also know that their own strength among the peasantry is limited. The party's roots are deeper in the cities and the army than in the villages. The party that truly symbolizes peasant aspirations is the Socialist Revolutionary Party, the SRs, whose program has long included the redistribution of land. If the new government tries to resist these rural changes, it will be crushed by a tide it cannot stop. If it embraces them, it might gain from them, even if it is not the original author of the idea. And so the decree on land does something radical and simple. It abolishes private ownership of land as a legal category. It declares that the big estates are no longer private property, and acknowledges that peasant committees may seize and redistribute them. In effect, It takes the scattered, illegal acts of land seizure happening across the countryside and wraps them in the cloak of state approval. For the peasants, this decree feels like a recognition. Their actions are no longer crimes. They are, in a sense, the implementation of a new order. They do not receive deeds in the modern sense, but they receive something they may consider even more meaningful: the absence of anyone with a stronger legal claim over their soil. For the Bolsheviks, the decree has a different, more strategic function. It helps to neutralize a potentially dangerous opponent. If the village majority now believes that the Soviet government is protecting their land gains, they are less likely to rally in large numbers against that government. This does not mean that peasants become passionate supporters of Bolshevik rule overnight, but it does mean that large-scale peasant revolts against the new regime become less likely, at least in the short term. Their energy is directed more towards completing the redistribution than towards questioning the authority that has legitimized it. In the cities, another decree addresses the world of work. The industrial landscape of Russia in 1917 is a patchwork of factories large and small, some producing weapons, others textiles or consumer goods. Many are short of fuel, raw materials, and spare parts. Owners have fled abroad, gone into hiding, or simply given up. Workers have already formed factory committees in many places. Organs that began as strike committees or representative councils and now act as partial managers in their own right. The decree on workers' control takes this growing reality and gives it state recognition. It does not fully nationalize industry yet. That will come later, through other measures. Instead, it grants factory committees the right to oversee production, to supervise hiring and firing, and to check accounts. In some plants, this means workers now decide what is produced and how. In others, it creates a dual structure where owners and managers still exist, but their decisions are watched and sometimes overturned by committees of employees. For workers who have struggled for years to be seen and heard in their workplaces, this decree is a powerful symbol. The factory is no longer just the space of a boss's authority. It becomes, at least in principle, a place where those who labor have a voice in decisions that shape their lives. At the same time,
The decree contains an element of risk. Giving worker committees control in a collapsing economy can sometimes lead to decisions that make sense locally but worsen the overall situation. Keeping open unprofitable plants, resisting any layoffs or reorganizations, or prioritizing immediate wages over long-term investment. The Bolsheviks themselves will later wrestle with these contradictions, trying to reconcile workers' control with central planning. But in these first months, the decree is less about rationalizing production and more about solidifying a bond with the industrial base that has supported the revolution. Taken together, these early decrees form a kind of moral foundation for the new state. They say to soldiers, peasants, and workers, "Your demands have been heard. We will seek peace. We will confirm your control of the land. We will recognize your authority in the factories." Yet in the background, another promise still hangs in the air, one that predates the Bolshevik rise to power. For years, across different phases of the revolutionary movement, one institution has been spoken of as the expression of the people's will: the Constituent Assembly. It is imagined as a great national gathering elected by universal suffrage that will write a constitution and decide the future shape of the state.
The provisional government had delayed it again and again, citing war, disorder, and administrative difficulties. The Bolsheviks themselves had attacked those delays as proof that the old leadership feared the verdict of the people. Now, after October, it is their turn to face that verdict. In late November 1917, elections are finally held for the Constituent Assembly. For many ordinary men and women, this is their first experience of free, nationwide voting. Peasants in remote villages, workers in cities, soldiers at the front, all receive ballots and mark them, often guided by local activists and party representatives. The results, when they come, reflect the varied nature of Russian society. In the countryside, the socialist revolutionaries, with their long-standing promise of land socialization and their deep roots in the villages, win by a wide margin. Roughly 40% of the total vote goes to them. In the cities and among soldiers, the Bolsheviks perform far better, reflecting their strength in urban Soviets and in the army. Overall, they receive around a quarter of the national vote. The rest is divided among various smaller parties, including liberal cadets and national groups. On paper, this result means that if the Constituent Assembly becomes the supreme authority, the Bolsheviks will not control it. They will be an important faction, but not the majority. In many older political traditions, this would be interpreted as a clear signal: form coalitions, compromise, adjust your program to the parliamentary arithmetic. Lenin sees it differently. For him, the legitimacy that matters most does not come from a single nationwide vote held at a moment of great upheaval, but from the Soviets, the workers' and soldiers' councils that have led the revolution and now stand behind the Soviet government. In his eyes, the Constituent Assembly, elected on party lists that may already have been overtaken by events, cannot be allowed to override the living organs of revolutionary power. There is also a more practical point. The SR vote, strong as it is, hides internal divisions. The party itself is splitting between a right wing that is deeply suspicious of the Bolsheviks and a left wing that is more sympathetic to the Soviet government and its decrees. Yet the electoral lists had been drawn up before this split fully emerged. The majority inside the new assembly will belong to the more cautious, moderate wing, which is unlikely to accept Bolshevik rule. Lenin and his close allies conclude that if they surrender authority to this body, they will quickly find their decrees on peace, land, and workers' control challenged or dismantled. To them, this is not a neutral constitutional adjustment. It is the reversal of the revolution's gains. And so, as the new year approaches, a quiet, tense confrontation takes shape between two ideas of legitimacy: the elected Constituent Assembly and the network of Soviets whose authority the Bolsheviks claim to embody. On January 5, 1918, delegates from across Russia gather in Petrograd to attend the opening session of the assembly. Outside, it is winter. Snow lies on the streets, and the days are short and dim. Inside the Tauride Palace, the hall is filled with representatives who have come through a country in turmoil to sit under bright lamps and carved ceilings, surrounded by the echoes of older parliaments. There is a sense of anticipation among some spectators and participants. For them, this day is the fulfillment of a promise made in 1905 and reaffirmed in 1917, that Russia will finally have a representative body to decide its future peacefully. But the atmosphere is also heavy with tension. The Bolsheviks,
though present, know that they are a minority in this chamber. They have no intention of allowing this majority to dictate policy to Sovnarkom. The SRs, with their plurality, feel that the time has come to assert parliamentary authority and to place the Soviet government under the control of a wider, elected assembly. The session quickly reveals how far apart the sides are. Speeches are made, resolutions are proposed. The SR majority refuses to recognize the supremacy of the Soviet government and resists endorsement of the key Bolshevik decrees. For them, the Soviet structures should be subordinate to the assembly. For the Bolsheviks, this reverses the logic of the revolution. The debates grow sharper, the language more acrimonious. There is no sign of convergence. Late in the night, as it becomes clear that the assembly will not accept the primacy of Soviet power, the Bolshevik and Allied delegates rise and walk out. They leave the hall, abandoning the body that, in another historical path, might have become the heart of Russian democracy. Outside, Red Guards are already on duty. They do not storm the building or attack the deputies. They wait. When the exhausted assembly continues its work deep into the early hours, with smaller and smaller numbers remaining, it becomes increasingly clear that its decisions will have little force if those who control the ministries, the telegraphs, and the armed detachments do not intend to obey them. The next day, January 6, 1918, the Soviet government formally dissolves the Constituent Assembly by decree. The building is closed. When some deputies arrive, they find the doors locked and guards on watch, who politely but firmly turn them away. It is a quiet end. There is no dramatic clash, no bloody repression at that moment, but the symbolism is profound. With the closing of those doors, the last significant democratic alternative to Soviet rule is set aside. From this point, the structure of power in Russia hardens in a new direction. One party, resting on the Soviets it dominates, holding the levers of the state. For some, this feels like a betrayal of earlier promises. For others, particularly among the Bolsheviks and their followers, it feels like a necessary step, a refusal to allow the hard-won gains of the revolution to be undone by a parliament they see as tied to older, more cautious forces. In the months and years that follow, the consequences of this decision will become clearer as civil war breaks out. Opposition parties are pushed aside, and the Soviet state develops its own forms of control and coercion. But in the winter of 1917-1918, what most people see are the immediate effects. Soldiers sense that peace is being pursued, even if imperfectly. Peasants sense that the land is, at last, in their hands. Workers sense that they have new powers inside their factories, and those who had hoped for a broad, pluralistic democracy begin to understand that this path is closing. In this way, the first decrees and the brief life of the Constituent Assembly mark a turning point
that is quieter than the storming of palaces, but no less decisive. They show how a revolution that promised both social transformation and political freedom begins to choose between those goals, prioritizing one model of power over another. As the snow continues to fall on Petrograd streets in that early revolutionary winter, the outlines of the new state become more distinct. A government of people's commissars ruling in the name of Soviets, with peace, land, and workers' power written into its first acts, and with its main parliamentary rival gently swept aside. The old world is gone. The new one is still being built, with all its hopes and all its shadows, under the pale light of a Russian dawn.
Chapter 10. The Shameful Peace That Saved the Revolution. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, 1918. As the autumn of 1917 faded into winter, the new Bolshevik government found itself facing a sobering truth: ending the war, the very promise that had brought so many workers and soldiers to their side, would not be a simple matter of words or declarations. Russia was exhausted, yes, but so too were the armies pushing steadily toward Petrograd. Even after the October Revolution, German forces showed no sign of halting their advance. They continued to move deeper into former imperial territories as if the political changes in Russia meant nothing at all. Inside the leadership of the new Soviet state, anxiety mingled with fierce debate. For years, the old regime had spoken about honor and victory. Now the Bolsheviks spoke instead about survival. Yet even within their ranks, there was no agreement on what that survival should look like. Some, like Nikolai Bukharin, believed that the only honorable answer was to keep fighting. Revolutionary war, he insisted, was not merely a military strategy, but a moral one. Russia should refuse the Germans' demands, stand firm, and hope that resistance in Russia would help spark revolutionary uprisings across Europe. If socialism was truly international, he argued, then courage would surely be rewarded by the awakening of workers beyond Russia's borders. Others were less idealistic, but equally determined that Russia should not sign a humiliating peace. Leon Trotsky proposed a curious middle path, one that captured the mood of indecision spreading across the country. He called it "No War, No Peace." In practice, it meant withdrawing from active fighting, but refusing to sign a treaty. Russia would simply announce that it was done with the war and walk away. It sounded bold and almost elegant, a way to end the killing without bowing to the harsh demands of Germany and its allies. But Vladimir Lenin, watching the Germans inch closer to Petrograd and seeing the fragile structures of the new Soviet state tremble under the weight of famine, disorder, and civil unrest, argued quietly and relentlessly for something simpler: peace at any cost. For Lenin, the revolution itself was the priority. Withdraw now, he urged, even if the price is terribly high. As he saw it, there would be no socialist future at all if the infant government fell before it learned to walk. Russia needed time to organize the economy, to build the Red Army, to establish authority across the shattered landscape of the old empire. A harsh treaty could be revised later. A destroyed government could not. Events soon swept away every alternative. In February 1918, after weeks of stalling by Trotsky's delegation, German troops resumed their offensive. This time they moved with startling speed and overwhelming force. It was no longer a matter of theoretical debate. The Bolsheviks suddenly saw that Petrograd itself was at risk, and the revolution with it. Faced with this terrifying momentum, Trotsky's posture collapsed. Lenin's view, once controversial, became the only realistic option. And so, on March 3, 1918, Soviet negotiators signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, one of the most severe peace settlements inflicted on any major power in modern history. The terms were devastating. Russia was compelled to renounce vast stretches of its former empire. Poland, Ukraine, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all were removed from Russian control. These were not abstract territories listed on a map. They were home to millions of people, rich farmlands, important cities, and industries that had fed and powered the old empire. Parts of the Caucasus slipped away as well. What remained of Soviet Russia felt diminished, hollowed out, a great land suddenly aware of its own fragility. The losses were staggering when seen in numbers. Russia sacrificed a third of its population, nearly a third of its agricultural land, more than half of its industrial capacity, and almost 9/10 of its coal mines. Even the country's railways, the arteries that connected its enormous spaces, were deeply cut, with a quarter of them lost to the new map. To many outside the Bolshevik leadership, it seemed an act of national humiliation. The left socialist revolutionaries, who had been uneasy partners in government, saw the treaty as a betrayal of the revolution's promise. They walked out, leaving the Bolsheviks to govern alone. Across the country, people murmured, confused, and disheartened. How could a revolution born in hope begin its life with surrender? And yet, behind the bitterness and shame, the treaty accomplished the one thing Lenin had insisted was essential. It bought time. For the moment, the German guns fell silent. The Eastern Front, which had swallowed millions of lives, dissolved. The Bolsheviks could now redirect their energy inward, toward organizing the fragile Red Army, stabilizing the city's failing food supplies, and asserting authority over distant regions where rival powers, local militias, and foreign armies were beginning to stir. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was a wound, and everyone knew it. But it also gave the young Soviet state the breathing space it desperately needed. It was not a triumphant peace, nor a proud one. It was, as many called it at the time, a shameful peace. But history would show that without this painful moment of retreat, the revolution might not have survived the year. In that quiet, uneasy spring of 1918, Russia stepped back from the brink of destruction. The price was enormous, but the possibility of a future, a Soviet future, remained alive, flickering but unextinguished. And with that fragile light, the next chapter of the revolution would begin.
Chapter 11. When the Country Tore Apart. The Beginning of the Civil War. 1918. As the first months of Bolshevik rule unfolded, the vast landscape of the former Russian Empire began to tremble and split. The country had already endured years of war, revolutions, hunger, and political chaos. But in 1918, something even darker began to settle over the land. A slow, rumbling descent into a conflict that would touch every region, every class, and every family. It was a civil war that unfolded not in a single moment, but like a spreading fire that caught the dry grass of a broken empire. Everything seemed to be coming apart at once. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk had torn away huge portions of territory. The Constitutional Assembly had been dissolved almost as soon as it met, extinguishing the last symbol of a parliamentary path. And across the country, movements opposed to Bolshevik rule stirred restlessly, finding excuses, opportunities, or even simple survival instincts that pushed them toward rebellion. Russia had not yet found a stable center. Instead, it fragmented into armed groups, political factions, and local powers, each convinced they held the key to saving the nation or reclaiming what they believed had been stolen. Out of this fragmentation emerged the forces that would be known collectively as the Whites. But they were not a unified army, nor a cohesive movement. They were a loose gathering of those who could not accept the Bolshevik vision.
old Tsarist officers who had once served the Romanov dynasty with pride, constitutional liberals who had dreamed of building a Western-style democracy, nationalists who wanted a strong, indivisible Russia, and even some socialists, men and women who had supported reform but not revolution, and who now recoiled from Lenin's uncompromising rule. Each white leader carved out their own sphere of influence. In the South, General Anton Denikin rallied troops who still believed in the old military codes. In the distant East, across the snowy reaches of Siberia, Admiral Alexander Kolchak declared himself the supreme ruler of Russia, hoping to gather scattered anti-Bolshevik forces under a single banner. And in the northwest, near the approaches to Petrograd, General Nikolai Yudenich commanded a smaller but determined army. Together, they formed the spine of the White Resistance. Yet they were scattered across thousands of kilometers, divided by ideology, geography, and clashing ambitions. Despite their shared hatred of Bolshevism, they struggled to unite, and this weakness would shadow them throughout the conflict. Far from these political centers, another unexpected force ignited the war: the Czech Legion. These were soldiers, around 40,000 of them, who had originally been prisoners of war under the Tsar. Many were Czech or Slovak nationalists who longed for their own independent homeland. They had fought loyally for Russia in the First World War, hoping that the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire would bring freedom to their people. After the Bolshevik takeover, the Legion made plans to leave Russia by traveling eastward along the Trans-Siberian Railway, boarding ships in Vladivostok, and continuing the fight against the Central Powers in Europe. But tensions flared. Orders were issued. Accusations were made. And in May 1918, along the endless railway line that stretched from Europe to the Pacific, something snapped. Skirmishes broke out between the Czech Legion and local Bolshevik authorities. Misunderstandings turned into armed clashes, and before long, the Legion seized control of large stretches of the railway. Town after town along the line fell into their hands, cutting Bolshevik-controlled European Russia off from Siberia's vital grain reserves. Their rebellion triggered a cascade of uprisings by other anti-Bolshevik groups all along the route. What had begun as an evacuation had transformed into a military revolt with enormous consequences. And the world outside Russia was watching. The Allied powers, Britain, France, the United States, and Japan, had their own worries. Russia's sudden exit from the First World War alarmed them. They feared German troops might capture the massive stockpiles of Allied supplies stored in Russian ports. Some hoped the war on the Eastern Front might somehow be reopened, and others simply wanted to prevent Bolshevik influence from spreading. So, in the summer of 1918, small Allied expeditionary forces landed quietly at distant edges of the former empire. British, American, and French troops disembarked in Archangel, far to the north, where icy winds swept the White Sea. More Allied troops, along with a large Japanese force, arrived in Vladivostok, the empire's eastern gateway on the Pacific. Officially, they came to protect supplies and help evacuate the Czech Legion. But their presence provided moral support, materiel, and a degree of legitimacy to anti-Bolshevik armies. The Bolsheviks seized this moment with a keen sense of political instinct. They framed these foreign arrivals as invaders, imperialists, a threat to the revolution and the motherland. They used this narrative to great effect,
stirring fear and patriotism among workers and soldiers. Every Allied landing, every rumor of foreign interference strengthened the claim that the Bolsheviks alone stood as defenders of Russia's future. Meanwhile, a darker shadow passed over the heart of the empire: the fate of the Romanov family. In a small city in the Ural Mountains called Yekaterinburg, the former Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children were being held under close guard. For the Bolsheviks, the ex-Tsar was not just a fallen monarch, he was a symbol, a potential rallying point. As white armies advanced across the Urals in the summer of 1918, drawing ever nearer to the city, the Bolsheviks feared that the Romanovs might be liberated and restored as figureheads of the counter-revolution. And so, in a decision steeped in secrecy and foreboding, the local Soviet, acting with approval from the central leadership, chose to eliminate that possibility forever. On a quiet, grim night between July 16th and 17th, the entire Romanov family, Nicholas, Alexandra, their children Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and little Alexei, along with 4 loyal attendants, were led to the basement of the house where they were imprisoned. There they were executed. Their bodies were taken into the forest and hidden. The act was shocking, even in a year already marked by violence and upheaval. It closed the door completely on the old dynasty, and it revealed, with stark clarity, the lengths to which the Bolsheviks were willing to go to shape the future they believed in. The execution did not end the civil war. If anything, it intensified the hatred of their enemies. But it also ensured that no Tsarist restoration, even symbolically, could arise. As 1918 moved forward, Russia found itself in a whirlwind of battles, shifting front lines, hunger, propaganda, and immense human suffering. Villages changed hands repeatedly, local loyalties shifted, families were torn apart as brothers joined different armies. The empire that had stretched across continents now fractured into zones of control, each governed by its own leaders, its own dreams, its own fears. What began that year was not merely a civil war in the political sense. It was a struggle that touched every aspect of life, reshaped entire regions, and created scars that would linger for generations. The Bolsheviks had taken power, but keeping it would prove to be an even more formidable challenge. And in the chapters that follow, the story of this long and devastating conflict will continue to unfold, revealing how the Bolsheviks fought not only for territory, but for the very survival of the revolution they had brought into being.
Chapter 12. The Shadow That Watched Everything, the Red Terror, and the Birth of the Cheka. As the Russian Revolution entered its 2nd year, the world around the new Bolshevik government grew darker and more uncertain. The empire was unraveling, foreign armies were approaching its borders, and rebellions simmered in regions far from the capital. In that atmosphere of fear and anxiety, the Bolsheviks made a choice that would shape the emotional and moral texture of their young state for years to come. They decided that survival required not only determination on the battlefield, but also an iron grip on the streets, in the villages, and in the hidden corners of daily life. It was during these turbulent months, in December of 1917, that a new institution was created, one that would become both the shield and the shadow of the revolution. It was called the Cheka, short for the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission, and it was led by a man whose icy discipline would become legendary, Felix Dzerzhinsky. Those who met him often remarked on his severity, but also on his unwavering belief that terror, if used decisively, could protect the fragile new world taking shape in Russia. To many Bolsheviks, he seemed like the embodiment of revolutionary vigilance, a watchful guardian standing between them and the chaos they feared. The Cheka was granted extraordinary powers almost immediately. It did not need to wait for slow legal procedures or lengthy investigations. Instead, it acted swiftly, arresting, interrogating, and sometimes executing anyone it believed threatened the revolution. What counted as a threat was defined broadly: former Tsarist officers, wealthy merchants, outspoken critics, priests, or merely individuals suspected of sympathizing with opposition groups. In those early weeks, the Cheka did not yet have the vast machinery it would later build, but it already possessed something far more potent: the authority to act without hesitation. As the Civil War intensified in 1918, the Bolsheviks' anxiety deepened. White armies were pressing toward central Russia. Peasant uprisings flared across the countryside. Former allies, including the left socialist revolutionaries, rose up in rebellion. Every day brought alarming telegrams and rumors of plots. In this climate, repression became not just a tool, but a reflex, a constant tightening of the fist. Then, on a warm August evening in 1918, a single event pushed the Bolsheviks into a new, darker phase. Lenin had just finished speaking to a gathering of factory workers in Moscow when a woman stepped forward and fired 2 shots at him. Her name was Fanny Kaplan, a member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party who believed Lenin had betrayed the revolution's democratic promise. The bullets struck him in the arm and neck, and for a moment it seemed he might not survive. News of the attack spread rapidly, sending waves of fear throughout the Bolshevik leadership. It confirmed everything they already believed about the dangers surrounding them, and it created the emotional spark that allowed harsher methods to feel not only justified, but necessary. Shortly after the attempt on Lenin's life, the government declared what it called the Red Terror. Under this new policy, the Cheka was given explicit instructions to pursue counter-revolutionaries with uncompromising severity. In practice, this meant mass arrests, swift executions, and the creation of early concentration camps for those deemed enemies of the state. Entire categories of people were suddenly marked as potential threats: former nobles, wealthy landowners, officers of the imperial army, religious leaders, or those who voiced even mild opposition, found themselves vulnerable to denunciation. The atmosphere in many towns changed almost overnight. People spoke more softly. They watched their neighbors more closely. The knock at the door after midnight, once associated with the old Tsarist police, became a sign of the new revolutionary vigilance. The Bolsheviks defended these measures as painful but unavoidable, insisting that the survival of the revolution outweighed individual rights or legal niceties. To them, the state they were building was like a newborn in a storm, fragile and endangered, needing protection from every gust of counter-revolutionary wind. Yet, behind that justification lay something deeper and more unsettling: the acceptance of terror as a permanent instrument of governance. Within a year, the Cheka had expanded across the entire country. Regional branches sprang up in cities, towns and railway hubs. Its agents, often identifiable by their long leather coats, became symbols of fear and authority. And as the Civil War entered its most violent phase, the Cheka's presence became woven into everyday life. In train stations, on factory floors, in villages, and even along remote stretches of the countryside. By 1919, the Cheka was not merely a secret police organization. It had grown into a vast, interconnected system that defined how the Bolshevik state understood loyalty, suspicion, and power. It stood as the watchful eye behind the front lines, the institution tasked with ensuring that the revolution survived not only on battlefields, but within the hearts and habits of the population. In the darkness of those years, one could feel the weight of the choices being made. Historians often describe the Red Terror as an eruption of violence, but in the quiet moments, it also represented something more muted, an unspoken acknowledgement that the ideals of the revolution were being carried forward through methods that contradicted their spirit. The Bolsheviks, convinced that the stakes were absolute, embraced terror not as a momentary measure, but as a necessary companion to their vision of a transformed society. As the Civil War continued, the Cheka would evolve again and again, eventually becoming one of the most powerful institutions in Soviet history. But those first years, from 1918 to 1919, were the crucible in which its identity was forged. Sharp, unyielding, and driven by a belief that the revolution's survival justified any act committed in its name. And in that shadowed landscape, the Red Terror settled over Russia like a cold mist, quiet, pervasive, and deeply intertwined with the birth of a new political world.
Chapter 13. Living on Almost Nothing. Life under War Communism.
As the Russian Revolution pushed deeper into uncharted territory, the Bolshevik leadership soon discovered that winning political power was only the beginning of their struggle. Behind the front lines, a quieter but equally devastating battle was unfolding, a battle against hunger, collapse, and the slow unraveling of everyday life. The winter of 1918 ushered in a period that would later be known as War Communism, a harsh and improvised economic system born from desperation rather than design. To picture this moment, imagine a vast country shuddering from years of war, famine, and dislocation. Railways stood silent because no coal could reach the engines. Workshops that once rang with the sound of metal and machinery now echoed with emptiness. Even in the larger cities, entire neighborhoods lived day to day without knowing where their next meal might come from. The revolution, full of fiery promise only months earlier, now faced an existential threat from something as simple and as overwhelming as hunger. The Bolsheviks, still fighting civil war on multiple fronts, could not afford the collapse of the cities or the army. If the urban workers fell into starvation, if factories ceased production entirely, or if soldiers no longer had bread in their packs, the revolution would wither before it had time to take root. And so, driven by urgency, they began reshaping the economy with the same sense of martial determination they brought to the battlefield. The total nationalization of life. At the heart of war communism lay the idea that every available resource, every nail, every engine, every grain of wheat, must be directed toward survival. Private factories were taken over and placed under the control of the state. Managers suddenly found themselves working under the orders of new commissars. Railroads, too, were seized and incorporated into a single, centrally directed system. What had once functioned through markets and commerce was now woven into a tight web of emergency administration. Banks followed next. By taking control of the entire financial system, the Bolsheviks aimed to remove the last traces of private economic influence. For many ordinary Russians, this meant waking up one day to discover that their savings existed more in memory than in practice. Money, in the old sense, was losing meaning anyway. Inflation eroded the value of the ruble until a day's wages could hardly buy a loaf of bread. It soon became common for workers to be paid not in cash, but in goods: firewood, soap, clothing, or sometimes even the bread they produced on the job. The grain requisitioning campaign. But the deepest line of tension ran between the cities and the countryside. Russia was still, overwhelmingly, a nation of peasants. Grain flowed from village fields into urban markets, at least in normal times. But years of war and the collapse of currency meant peasants saw little point in selling their harvests. Why hand over grain in exchange for paper money that could not buy anything in return? To the Bolsheviks, this hesitation felt like a threat to the very survival of the revolution. And so, the state dispatched armed food detachments, squads of workers, soldiers, and sometimes party members to seize grain directly from the countryside. The official purpose was to collect only surplus harvests. In practice, the line between surplus and necessity blurred, and requisitioning became an excruciating experience for rural families. Peasants who resisted risked arrest, confiscation, or in extreme cases, violent punishment. Villages sometimes hid grain in secret pits. Detachments dug up barns and tore up floors looking for hidden stores. The countryside simmered with resentment, but with the front lines raging and the state desperate, the policy continued. War communism fed the army and the cities for the moment, yet it planted seeds of bitterness that would bear their own fruit later. A world without markets. As markets vanished, daily routines shifted into something both strange and rigid. Buying and selling ceased. Shops emptied. Prices became meaningless. The state distributed food by ration cards, and families often stood in lines that stretched for hours, sometimes in the bitter cold, hoping the supply would not run out before their turn arrived. Barter replaced currency. A worker with access to warm boots might trade them for potatoes. Someone with an extra coat might exchange it for soap or kerosene. Life, in a sense, moved backwards in time, away from the bustling economy of the early 20th century and toward a more ancient, immediate way of surviving. Labor under the demands of war. Inside factories, the pressures of the Civil War intensified discipline. Strikes were forbidden. Absenteeism, staying home because of exhaustion, hunger, or illness, could be treated as a punishable offense. The government adopted a stern principle: he who does not work, neither shall he eat. It was meant to encourage productivity, but for many already weakened by shortages and cold, it became a haunting reminder of how fragile life had become. Factory committees struggled to keep production alive. Coal shortages meant machines ran only part of the day. Skilled workers vanished into the front lines or fled to the countryside in search of food. Those who remained often labored in freezing workshops, their breath visible in the unheated air. The economic collapse reaches its breaking point. By 1920, the effects of war communism were unmistakable. Industrial output fell to merely a fraction of what it had been before the First World War, around 1/5 of the old levels. Many industries, especially those needing electricity or imported materials, simply stopped functioning. In rural areas, the pressure of requisitioning mixed with war, drought, and a general breakdown of order. Harvests dwindled. Farmers lacked seed grain. In some cases, they deliberately reduced cultivation to avoid having their produce seized. The countryside grew quieter as livestock disappeared and fields went untilled. All of this culminated in one of the most devastating tragedies of the early Soviet period, the famine of 1921-1922. It swept across the Volga region in particular, where hunger hollowed out entire communities. Millions died. Families wandered from village to village in search of food. The Bolshevik state, shaken by the scale of the disaster, eventually allowed foreign relief organizations to enter, a rare concession in those early, tightly controlled years. A system born of crisis. Yet for all its human cost, war communism achieved one narrow purpose. It allowed the Bolshevik regime to survive the Civil War. Armies were fed. Cities, threadbare and diminished, held together long enough for the Red Army to defeat its enemies. The system was never meant to be permanent. It was a desperate solution to a desperate moment. But for those who lived through it, those years left deep marks. A memory of cold evenings waiting for rations, of silent factories and restless fields, of an economy tightened like a fist around the last threads of survival. It was a time when the revolution's dreams collided head-on with the reality of hardship, and when survival itself became a form of resistance.
Chapter 14. The year the tide slowly turned. The Civil War in 1919 to 1920. As the Great Civil War unfolded across the vast stretches of the former Russian Empire, the year 1919 emerged like a slow breath, held halfway between despair and recovery. At the start of that year, it seemed as if the Bolshevik government might not survive much longer. The armies that opposed them, scattered but fierce, pressed inward from distant edges like waves testing a fragile shore. In Siberia, Admiral Alexander Kolchak pushed westward with single-minded resolve. Far to the south, General Anton Denikin drove relentlessly toward Moscow from the wide, wind-swept plains. And in the cold northwest, General Nikolai Yudenich gathered his forces for 2 determined strikes at Petrograd, the symbolic cradle of the revolution. For a moment, all these advances created the impression that the Bolsheviks stood on the brink of collapse. And yet, by the time that year slowly gave way to winter, something had shifted. What once looked like a certain red defeat began to dissolve, and the balance of the war tilted in an entirely new direction. At the heart of that transformation was the Red Army itself, reshaped with deliberate, disciplined care. Leon Trotsky, the fiery and brilliant war commissar, traveled constantly in his armored train, covering thousands of kilometers to enforce order where it faltered, to inspire where courage wavered, and to unify commanders who were still learning the art of managing a vast, modern war. Under his direction, a fighting force of more than 5 million eventually came together,
uneven at first and stitched from disparate fronts, but increasingly effective with every passing month. When we look closely at how the tide turned, certain themes stand out, like quiet constellations guiding the course of events. One of them was geography. The Bolsheviks controlled the core of European Russia, that central heartland where the largest cities stood, where factories hummed with what little strength remained, and where the railway lines intertwined like veins feeding the country's remaining industrial life. From these interior positions, Red commanders could shift troops from one threatened front to another with greater ease than their adversaries. Meanwhile, the White armies, stretching across unimaginably vast peripheries, separated by thousands of kilometers of steppe, forest, and mountain, struggled to communicate, let alone coordinate. Their distance from one another was not only physical, but political and personal as well. And that leads to another quiet truth of this turning point: unity, or the lack thereof. The Bolsheviks, whatever inner disagreements they held, managed to speak with one voice on the battlefield. Their command system, infused with both strict discipline and an unyielding belief in their revolutionary cause, allowed them to adapt quickly. In contrast, the White movement suffered from deep fissures within its own ranks. It was an uneasy coalition of monarchists yearning for the old order, liberals hoping for some new constitutional future, and various socialists and officers whose dreams did not align. These leaders distrusted one another, argued over strategy, and seldom coordinated their offensives. Each fought their own war, believing it to be the decisive one, but rarely working in harmony. Politics, too, played a silent yet profound role in this turning point. The Bolsheviks, for all their harshness and rigidity, offered land to the peasants and a promise, however uncertain, of a new social order. Their message was simple and emotional, echoing in the exhausted villages and factories: peace, land, bread. The White movement could not match this. Many of its leaders either ignored or opposed land reform, speaking of a Russia one and indivisible that did not resonate with millions of peasants who longed for local autonomy or simply wanted the land they worked to be theirs. In regions where Ukrainians, Finns, Poles, and other national groups dreamed of self-determination, the White commitment to restoring the old empire felt like a heavy hand closing over their aspirations. Thus, wherever White armies advanced, they often inspired fear or indifference rather than support. By the start of 1920, the consequences of these patterns became unmistakable. Kolchak's army, which had surged westward with early energy, was pushed back across the endless Siberian landscape. His regime collapsed under the weight of military defeats and political discontent. He was captured and executed by local partisans as he attempted to flee eastward, a stark end to his vision of restoring Russia. In the south, Denikin's forces came remarkably close to Moscow, within only a few hundred kilometers, but a combination of overextension, supply problems, and growing partisan resistance forced a long, painful retreat. Denikin himself left command soon afterward, as the dream of a triumphant march on the capital faded like breath into cold air. His successor, General Wrangel, held on in Crimea with tenacity and skill, but even that final outpost could not last. By late 1920, Red forces stormed the peninsula. What followed was a massive evacuation by sea, ships crowded with soldiers, officers, families, and civilians who feared the reprisals they believed would come under Bolshevik rule. For many, it was the last time they would see their homeland. In the northwest, Yudenich's determined attempts to seize Petrograd faltered as well. The city, battered and hungry but symbolically resolute, repelled the advances with a mixture of military resistance and political resolve. The failure of these offensives marked the fading of the last serious White threat in European Russia. And so, by the end of 1919 and the beginning of 1920, A war that had once appeared hopeless for the Bolshevik government began to transform into something different, a long, grinding consolidation of power. The main white armies had been defeated, their leaders forced into exile or captured, and their supporters scattered. Although fighting would continue in far-flung corners of the former empire until 1922, the central battle for control of Russia had effectively been decided. What remained was a landscape reshaped by war, villages stripped bare, cities exhausted, families scattered, and hopes reshaped by trauma. But amid all this hardship, the Reds emerged as the uncontested power over the Russian heartland. The tide had turned, and with that shift, the path to the new Soviet state, with all its future triumphs and tragedies, lay open before them.
Chapter 15: Dreams of Europe and the Anger at Home. The Polish-Soviet War and the Green Rebellions, 1920–1921. As the Great Civil War within Russia began to quiet in the distance, another tide of conflict slowly rose on the Western horizon. The Bolsheviks, newly triumphant against their most formidable internal rivals, looked outward with renewed conviction. They believed, perhaps with a sense of destiny, that the Russian Revolution would not be complete unless it lit a similar spark beyond its borders. And so, as 1920 unfolded, their eyes turned toward Europe, toward the restless new nation of Poland, and toward a hope, or an illusion, that history might be ready for another sweeping revolution. Poland had only recently stepped back onto the map after more than a century of being carved apart by its neighbors. It was young, proud, and determined to define itself. Yet, to the Bolsheviks, that same Poland seemed like a gateway. If the Red Army could break through its defenses, perhaps the revolutionary flame might leap into Germany, where working-class unrest was still simmering. In this moment, Moscow dreamed of a chain reaction that could transform the entire continent. And for a brief, breathless period, it almost worked. In the summer of 1920, the Red Army pressed westward with astonishing speed. Commanders like Mikhail Tukhachevsky drove their forces deep into Polish lands, and cavalry detachments swept across wide plains once ruled by the Tsars. By August, Soviet troops reached the outskirts of Warsaw itself. The idea of revolution spreading across Europe seemed closer than ever, close enough to imagine, close enough to taste. But history has a way of surprising even the boldest of dreamers. At the very gates of their capital, the Polish army gathered its strength and, under the leadership of Józef Piłsudski, struck back with sudden determination. What followed became known as the Miracle on the Vistula, a moment when the Polish counterattack shattered the Red Army advance and sent the Red Army reeling back eastward. It was a reversal so sharp and so swift that it felt almost unreal. And in March 1921, the Treaty of Riga sealed the outcome. Vast stretches of western Belarus and Ukraine were ceded to Poland, and the dream of carrying the revolution into Europe faded into the cold air of reality. For the Bolsheviks, the failed campaign was more than a military setback. It was a reminder that the revolution, for all its fervor, could not be pushed into the world at will. The vision of spreading socialism on the tips of bayonets had slipped beyond their grasp, perhaps before it had ever truly been within their reach. And just as the Bolsheviks turned homeward, ready to rebuild and gather strength, they found an entirely different storm waiting for them,
one born not from foreign armies, but from the very people whose hardships had carried the revolution forward. These were the peasants, millions strong, scattered across villages and fields, who had endured years of war, requisitioning, hunger, and loss. For a long time, the peasants had been grudgingly neutral toward the Bolsheviks. They disliked landlords far more than they disliked the new government. But by 1920 and 1921, their patience had been pushed to its limit. Hardships imposed by war communism, grain seizures enforced at gunpoint, and the constant presence of armed detachments extracting food had hollowed out the countryside. And in many regions, the toll became unbearable. Uprisings began to simmer, then swell, spreading across whole provinces. These were the Green Rebellions, named for the color associated with the peasant armies that rose up, neither red nor white, but something entirely their own, a cry for survival, independence, and dignity. For the Bolsheviks, already exhausted by years of war and rebellion, Tambov posed a terrifying challenge. It was not the organized political opposition they had faced in cities, nor the disciplined white armies they had battled during the Civil War. It was something more elemental, the rebellion of the countryside itself. And so the response was swift and brutal. General Mikhail Tukhachevsky, recently returned from the collapse in Poland, was sent to Tambov with orders to stamp out the uprising by any means necessary. What followed was a grim campaign waged across forests and villages, a campaign that included executions, hostage-taking, village burnings, and even the controversial use of poison gas to force rebels from wooded hideouts. By the summer of 1921, Alexander Antonov's movement had been broken, its leaders dead or captured, its people scattered or imprisoned. Similar uprisings across Ukraine, Siberia, and other regions met the same fate. In these countryside wars, another truth of the revolution came to light. The Bolsheviks might claim to speak for peasants and workers, but they were now willing to turn overwhelming force upon them to maintain control. The dream of harmony between the state and the rural masses had dissolved into bitter conflict, leaving scars that would linger long after the guns fell silent. By 1921, a weary silence settled over much of the land. The Bolsheviks had survived foreign invasion, internal enemies, and now the fury of the peasantry. But victory came at a price. A country frayed, starved, and deeply mistrustful of the state that claimed to be building a better future. As this chapter closes, the revolution stands at a turning point. The dream of exporting socialism abroad has faded. The brutal struggles at home reveal the limits of ideology when confronted with hunger and hardship. And the government, shaken by crises on all sides, will soon be forced to reconsider how it governs, how it feeds its people, and how it understands the fragile relationship between power and those who must live under it. For now, though, in the quiet after the storms of 1920 and 1921, Russia pauses, battered, divided, but still standing, ready for the next chapter in its long and turbulent transformation.
Chapter 16. The Rebellion That Broke Hearts. Kronstadt. The Crisis of Victory and the New Economic Policy, 1921. As the winter of 1921 settled over Russia, it arrived not with peace, but with a heavy sense of fatigue. The long civil war was drawing to a close,
and the Bolsheviks stood triumphant over the last major white armies. Yet the country beneath their feet was deeply wounded. Entire cities had grown quiet as factories ran out of fuel and raw materials. In Petrograd and Moscow, workers trudged through icy streets in search of food that rarely came. Hunger emptied workshops, and protests became whispers of despair, rising from every neighborhood. Inside this exhausted country lived people who only a few years earlier had believed they were building a new and better world. Now, as victory finally seemed within reach, that same world felt strangely hollow. The Bolsheviks had won the war, but the revolution itself seemed to be slipping away from the spirit of those who had once embraced it. It was in this moment of tension and uncertainty that a sudden spark struck from an unexpected place, the naval base at Kronstadt. Kronstadt was not just any garrison. It was an island fortress in the frozen waters near Petrograd, and its sailors had been legendary for their loyalty during the early days of the revolution. They had protected the Bolsheviks in 1917, marched beside them, and helped bring down the old regime. But now, in 1921, those same sailors looked out at a country suffering from hunger, repression, and a sense that the revolution had lost its soul. And they decided they could no longer remain silent. Their uprising began with a declaration that echoed far beyond the ice-covered Gulf. They called for Soviets without Bolsheviks, a demand that the councils representing workers, peasants, and soldiers should once again be open and democratic, not controlled by one party alone. They insisted on the freedom to speak and print ideas, especially for the working people the revolution had claimed to serve. And they pleaded for an end to forced grain requisitioning, the harsh policy that had stripped villages of food and driven peasants into bitterness. These demands carried the weight of a nation's disappointment. Even Lenin admitted that the uprising was like a sudden flash of lightning illuminating a landscape that had been dark for too long. It revealed a Russia not simply tired, but approaching the brink of rebellion once again. But the Bolshevik leadership could not allow such a challenge to stand. They feared that Kronstadt might ignite a chain reaction across the country, undoing everything they had fought for. And so, despite the sailors' history of loyalty, the order was given to crush the revolt. In the bitter cold of mid-March 1921, Red Army soldiers moved across the frozen Gulf of Finland. Snow blew across the ice as they advanced toward the fortress under the command of Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky. What followed was a short but fierce battle, one fought between people who, only a few years earlier, had stood on the same side. When the fighting ended, Kronstadt fell. Many rebels were executed or imprisoned, and others fled desperately over the ice to Finland. The uprising had been extinguished, but the message it carried lingered, unsettling and impossible to ignore. Lenin understood this, and so, even as Kronstadt was being subdued, he turned toward a dramatic change in policy, one he hoped would calm the nation and pull it back from collapse. At the 10th Party Congress in Moscow, he announced the new economic policy, a striking reversal from the rigid control of war communism. The goal was simple but profound: to let the shattered economy breathe again. Under this new approach, peasants would no longer see their grain seized by force. Instead, they would pay a fixed tax, manageable, predictable, and whatever they produced beyond that could be sold freely at market. It was a small opening of freedom, but one that carried immense significance. Across the countryside, it offered a glimpse of relief, even hope.
In the cities, small businesses were allowed to return. Workshops, tiny factories, street stands, and private shops reopened. A new class of traders, half admired and half resented, emerged almost overnight: the Nepmen, who brought back a vibrant if modest marketplace. Restaurants began to appear, shoes could be bought again, and everyday items slowly returned to shelves. But the state did not withdraw completely. The commanding heights of the economy, the largest industries, the banks, the railways, and foreign trade remained firmly under government control. NEP was not a return to capitalism, but a pragmatic pause, a temporary step back so that the system could regain its strength. And remarkably, it worked. By 1922 and 1923, as the countryside recovered from famine and markets revived, the country began to feel more stable. Factories hummed again. Grain flowed back into the cities. For the first time in years, there was a sense that normal life might be possible. Still, beneath the calm surface, new social tensions quietly formed. Richer peasants, thriving traders, and debates within the Communist Party about the future of the revolution. These questions would grow sharper after Lenin's death, but for now, NEP provided a much-needed moment of recovery. In the silence that followed the storms of war, Russia began, slowly, cautiously, to rebuild its strength. The revolution had survived the hardest years of its early life, and now, in the early 1920s, the country entered a fragile period of reflection, a moment suspended between the devastation behind it and the uncertainties that lay ahead. Chapter 17. The Birth of the Soviet Union, 1922. By the early 1920s, after years of war, uprisings, and profound social change, a long-awaited calm began to settle over the vast lands of the former Russian Empire. It was not peace in any complete sense, nor was it a return to normal life. Instead, it felt more like the quiet that follows a great storm, the moment when the winds finally weaken, leaving behind a landscape forever altered. Across this immense territory, the Bolshevik government faced a new kind of task. For 5 turbulent years, the revolution had been about survival, fighting Tsarist generals, foreign armies, and internal rebellion. But now, with the major armies defeated and independence movements subdued, the question had shifted. The Bolsheviks had to decide what kind of state would rise from the ruins of the empire they had overtaken. What form would this new political world take? Throughout the Civil War, different parts of the old empire had drifted away, torn loose by the chaos of 1917 and the struggles that followed. Ukraine had tried to chart its own path. Belarus, too, had been pulled into contests between Germans, Poles, Whites, and Reds. In the distant Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan had each established their own short-lived republics. Yet as Red Army victories accumulated in 1920, 1921, and 1922, these territories were gradually drawn back into the orbit of Moscow, not as imperial conquests, but as newly declared Soviet republics, each with its own communist government installed or supported by the Bolsheviks. By the end of 1922, the Bolshevik leadership realized that they were no longer presiding over an improvised wartime administration. They were governing a multi-ethnic realm with dozens of nationalities, languages, and traditions. The Tsarist Empire had ruled these diverse lands from a central throne, often by force and often without listening. The Bolsheviks claimed to reject that model, at least in principle. Now they needed a new structure, one that offered a sense of autonomy to each region,
while ensuring unity under the communist banner? The answer they devised was a federation, a union of republics that, on paper, stood as equals. On December 30th, 1922, delegates from several major Soviet republics gathered in Moscow. They came from the Russian Republic, which formed the largest core of territory, from Ukraine, with its deep agricultural plains and restless political history, from Belarus, positioned between Russia and Poland, and from the Transcaucasian Federation, which combined Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan
in a single administrative bloc. In a solemn meeting, after years of bloodshed and fragmentation, these representatives signed the treaty on the creation of the USSR. With their signatures, a new country, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, officially came into being. For those who witnessed the ceremony, it must have felt like stepping into a new world. The treaty promised a union built on equality, where each republic had its own institutions, its own government, and even a theoretical right to leave the federation if it chose. These ideas were soon woven into the 1924 Constitution, which laid out the principles of the new state. But beneath this promise of balance, another reality waited quietly. Although each republic had its own Soviet government, true authority rested in Moscow, within the Communist Party's inner leadership. The Politburo, a small group of men at the top of the party, made key decisions for the entire Union. Local party leaders in each republic took their guidance from this center, ensuring that policy moved in a single direction. What had begun as a revolutionary promise of empowering the workers and peasants had become, by 1922, an increasingly centralized and disciplined system. Yet for many ordinary people, the formation of the USSR brought a sense of closure. The old empire of the Romanovs was gone. The chaos of revolution and civil war had ended. The political future, at least for the moment, seemed to take on a definite shape. After years of uncertainty, this new structure offered stability, however controlled and restrictive it might have been. The birth of the Soviet Union also marked the close of a remarkable historical arc. The revolution of 1917 had begun with crowds demanding bread, peace, and freedom. It passed through moments of hope, of idealism, of confusion, and of harsh violence. By the time the USSR was founded, millions had died, in war, in famine, in political terror. Entire classes had been uprooted. Old institutions had vanished, and yet something entirely new stood in their place. The world's first socialist state, built on the foundations of a political ideology that promised a transformed society. From this point forward, the revolution transitioned into a state, a structured system that would carry its own momentum, confront new challenges, and eventually become one of the major powers of the 20th century. Its future would hold fierce internal struggles, the rise of Joseph Stalin, sweeping industrialization, tragedy, triumph, and global influence. But all of that still lay ahead. For now, in 1922, the revolutionary era had drawn to its end. What remained was a country both wounded and reborn, standing at the threshold of a new and uncharted story, one that would shape the modern world in ways few could yet imagine.